Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is all roads lead to Denerim in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. 81 Unrest at the alienage. Finn was nervous, but determined. As the alienage elves had begun gathering around the hospice that morning, Mila and Leliana had taken to the alleys to try to break in through the back. But Finn, no, he wanted to see these people who dared to kidnap his father. Face to face. He was going to get inside in the best way he knew how. So, there he was, in plain clothes, leaning on Zevran as she and he led the way through the morning crowd. He could hear people start whispering as they noticed him, but he refused to look away from the human figures up ahead. Zevran's presence at his elbow helped keep him from turning into a gibbering child who just wanted his father back, especially as he heard words of blame and suspicion bandied among the people he'd grown up among. "Easy now," one of the healers was calling to the crowd. "Everyone stay calm, and we'll help everyone we can." As the humans loomed closer, Finian's mind was racing with the many doubts surrounding their plan. By the time they were in the front, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on the back of his head. But then, one of the Tevinter healers turned to him and exclaimed, "Oh, you poor man. I've never seen someone so sick." Finian froze, not expecting quite so strong a reaction. Could they see through him? Come forward, come forward." This was better than could perhaps be believed. It made him suspicious. He scrounged up the most convincing stumble he could manage, letting Zevran keep him upright. Then, he coughed, and Zevran half-carried him before the healers. They were conferring among themselves, looking at him with genuinely worried expressions. "Tread carefully, Warden," an Antivan accent whispered in his ear. Finian pretended to stumble away from Zevran, toward the healers. "I heard you, eh? Cough, could heal the." He finished this one with a hacking cough. "You were smart to come to us. It's quite advanced. Come. Hurry." The healer grabbed him and helped him up onto the porch in front of the hospice. They really thought he was sick. Could they sense the taint in his blood? Was that what this plague was? The man helped him through the door into the hospice, which proved to be wide open and distinctly not filled with sick people. Once they were out of sight of the crowd outdoors, the healer shoved him toward a desk dominating one corner of the room and left, returning to his post outside. Guards crawled all over the interior, a good half-dozen in all. One of them stood behind the desk. "Ah, a new one. Come closer, elf." Finian was all too aware of his lack of armor, but at least his daggers were a familiar weight in his sleeves. Finn stumbled forward, pretending to cover another cough, but someone behind him had sharp eyes. "Wait a minute, something's wrong." A gauntleted hand grabbed his arm. "He's not sick, he's Dash." Finian spun around, his daggers popping out of his sleeve with a flash of steel. A moment later, the man that had grabbed him slumped to the ground, his face with a new hole in it. Hissing steel surrounded Finian as the other guards drew their weapons. The one behind the desk vaulted it to meet him. Finian burst into motion, spinning under the first guard's arms to punch a dagger into his gut. He felt a blade bite into his collar and skittered out of his range. He ducked between two as they tried to circle him, slashing both daggers across one guard's back as he passed. There was an advantage, he found, to his lack of proper armor. Never had he been able to move so smoothly in battle, ducking and weaving like a performer of the most deadly dance ever. This hardly offset the obvious disadvantage, as he felt a mace graze his back, and a sword bit into his knee. One guard stabbed low, but Finn spun to the attacker's side and got a jab into his armpit as he passed. Then, the elf was twisting out of the way of a maul, hopping over the weapon to punch both daggers into another guard's eye sockets. A great sword swiped in from the side, seeking to bisect him, and he dropped to the ground fast enough to bruise his elbows. The air of the sword passing above him ruffled his hair, and then that maul came down at him again. He rolled sideways, and a broadsword that had been waiting for him sliced open his side. He needed to get off the ground now. With a hiss, he kicked out at the arm holding the broadsword, knocking it aside. He then launched himself into the knees of that guard, sending them both to the ground and granting him a path out of the guards surrounding him. He sliced open that guard's throat on his way back to his feet. The maul wielder sideswiped him, and he was knocked aside with a new very painful bruise in the ribs. He stumbled into the desk, but decided to go with it, and rolled up onto it so that he was kneeling on the stacks of papers and ledgers. His hand found something round and hard, an inkwell. There were 3 guards remaining, one with a maul, one with a mace, and one with a great sword. They circled him in a leisurely manner, and Finian was alarmed to find himself feeling a little woozy. Gee, maybe fighting 6 armed men without armor hadn't been the best of plans. Wynne was going to give him such a disapproving grandmother look if he survived this. He wasn't about to make this easy for them, of course. He palmed the inkwell, and when the maul wielder came in at him, Finian threw it full force into the man's face, and it burst. The guard reeled back, clutching his eyes, and the other 2 burst into motion. By the time they reached the table, however, Finian had already flipped clear over the blinded guard and landed on the other side of him. The one with the great sword reached him first, and Finian used the stumbling maul wielder to his advantage, keeping the incapacitated guard between himself and the not-so-incapacitated one. When the great sword user hissed what Finn assumed was a Tevinter curse and just shoved his comrade aside to charge, Finn stepped to the side and tripped him. The charging guard went down, and Finn stabbed his daggers low into the man's back, aiming for the kidneys. The last guard got a good hit in with his mace for that, smashing a blow into Finian's back that had him gasping for breath and pretty sure he had a cracked rib now. The elf toppled forward, a bit more theatrically than was perhaps necessary, and fought to draw breath around a sharp pain in the back of his chest. The single remaining guard chuckled and worked his way calmly around Finn's limp form. "I think the boss will understand if we don't keep you alive," he said, coming to a stop right above Finn. The elf was on his stomach, so couldn't see above the guard's knee, but he could tell by the shifting of the man's weight that the guard was drawing back for a killing blow. He burst into motion, twisting to land a 2-legged kick right on the guard's kneecaps. He toppled on top of Finn, who had been expecting him, and had his daggers up to meet him right through the chest. He had a horrifying view of the man shuddering his last breaths, and shoved the man off of him. Finian sat up, wincing at the pain in his side, chest, knee, shoulder, and now that the rush of battle was wearing off, he was feeling a little more lightheaded than was probably good, considering at least 2 of the guards were still groaning and rolling around. No, he probably shouldn't pass out until he was the last thing alive in the room. With a shaking hand, he fumbled at his belt, where Mila had insisted he carry a healing poultice, on the rare chance he got into trouble. She'd deadpanned. And the others thought she didn't have a sense of humor. His fingers weren't really working all that well, tingles of cold crawling up his limbs. But he managed to get the poultice out and pressed it clumsily to the worst gash, the one at his side. He felt the healing herbs working in it almost immediately, warmth spreading from the point of contact, soothing the sharp pain in his chest and the stings of his myriad new cuts. Wynne had apparently been teaching Mila some things. Finn didn't remember Mila's concoctions being so potent before. That was probably fortunate. After a semi-suicidal stunt like that, just needing to have his clothes restitched could probably be counted as a victory. After a couple minutes of breathing, the wooziness faded, and Finian felt fit to stand without fainting. He glanced over at where the guy who'd taken the ink pot to the face was still groaning, but the man likely wouldn't be getting up any time soon. That was good enough for him. Still, it felt strange to stand over a bunch of bodies and realize that he had put them there. No one else. Maybe his mother, and Eden, and Duncan, and all those others had seen this in him, and that was what made him worthy of wielding his daggers. Or maybe he was just as crazy as people kept accusing him of being. More likely the latter, really. Carefully, he wiped his blades off on one of his attacker's clean shirts, then slid them back into their sheaths. They weren't hidden now, since his shirt was hopelessly torn. Finian made his way back over to the desk and, wiping the blood off his hands, he carefully handled the contents. He blanched as he discovered an order for 8 males and 6 females. It confirmed their suspicions about what was really going on. There were 2 other doors in the place. One went out through the back wall, so Finian carefully peeked into the other. Cages. They had the elves in teeny cages, like dogs. The warden stumbled back to the bodies, his fingers trembling from something other than weakness as he untied a keyring from a guard's belt. Then, he returned to the door and entered into the room, dropping to the floor in front of the nearest cage. The rectangular kennel was too small for one person, yet somehow it was holding 3. Finian. It was Caria, the woman who had once tailored his wedding outfit. She was trapped in one of the glorified bird cages against the opposite wall. "Finian Tabri? You're here? Did you kill them?" Finian nodded, watching his hands as he tried each key in turn. "Good. I hope you made those horrible people hurt." That was not the sort of thing he'd ever expected the tailor to say. The lock clicked open, and he moved to her cage. "Where's my father?" "He's gone." This was Alim, one of the alienage men a few years older than Finn. "They took him out the back. We don't know where." Finn nodded and moved to the next lock, unlocking each cage in turn. Once done, he stepped back, and the trapped elves climbed out. "Is it true you killed the king?" That was Maddle, a 15-year-old girl, and Finn paled to think what would have happened to her in Tevinter. "Maddle, hush!" Caria scolded. "I didn't," Finian said anyway, glancing through the doorway to make sure the way out was clear. "The Shems are all saying you did," the girl went on. "You and the wardens. There are posters." Finn froze. "Posters? Wanted posters?" "After the king died, they came into the alienage and asked a bunch questions to draw you for them." Finn suddenly felt dizzy. They had posters. Drawings. He hadn't thought of that possibility while crafting their disguises. "Oh Maker," he'd erred in showing his and Alistair's faces in Denerim. They needed to move ins, now. "Tabri." Alim prodded, watching him anxiously. "Something wrong?" Finn took a deep breath, then made himself turn back to the elves with a reassuring smile. "No. Come on, let's get all of you out of here." He beckoned them to follow and stepped out of the room. He heard gasps as they each spotted the pile of bodies, but no one commented on the mess. Finn gave them a wide berth even so. Recalling the two mages and small squad of guards out front, he led them toward the back door. Once he reached the door, he checked the elves behind him. They clustered together, still shaken but hopeful. He motioned them to silence, then crept up to the door. He could hear voices on the other side. He placed his right hand on the knob and twisted his left wrist, making one dagger spring out of its sheath into his left palm. Someone, probably Maddle, yelped at that. Carefully, Finn cracked the door open, and was instantly relieved to see two familiar redheads on the stoop outside. They were talking to a male elf that Finn didn't recognize. From the looks of it, the elf was the back door guard. As Finn watched, Leliana tried to sidle up to him with a playful smile, only to be rebuffed and told to leave. It may have been funny in any other circumstance, but they couldn't afford to waste time when a ship could leave port with Finn's father at any minute. Finian caught Mila's eye and bobbed his head in suggestion, and the Dalish elf nodded. Looking relieved, she stepped up and slammed the guard elf back against the door jamb, then executed a rolling move that flipped him over her shoulder, landing flat on the ground. When he tried to stand, Finn's dagger was there to greet him, and Finn lowered his free hand to muffle the guard's shout of alarm. The guard well in hand, Finn called back quietly, "You can come out now." The prisoners filed out silently. "Go home and lay low, and don't let the healers out front see you." All of them nodded, and someone, probably Maddle, muttered, "Duh." One by one, the elves dispersed, leaving the trio with their prisoner. When Finian turned his attention back to the guard, the warden noted that the other elf's eyes were rather fixated on the gore-encrusted sleeve now dangling directly above his face. Good, that would make his point quite nicely. "Listen, I don't know who you are or why you work for slavers against your own people, and I don't care. Your employers kidnapped my father and are trying to enslave everyone I've ever cared about, and I'm armed, highly trained, and rather short on mercy at the moment." He paused, waiting until the elf looked up to meet his gaze. "Now, I'm going to offer you a generous bribe to walk away from Denerim and never come back, and I suggest you take it." His smile was part honey, part steel. "What do you say? Nod or shake your head." Eyes wide, the guard nodded. Finian deftly sheathed his dagger and reached into his purse and dropped 6 sovereigns onto the man's chest, never losing eye contact. Then, he slowly removed his hand from the man's mouth and stood. The guard finally broke eye contact when he fumbled with the money and scrambled to his feet. He bobbed his head once, part intimidation and part gratitude, and then skittered off, disappearing into an alley. Finn sighed, rubbing his face. He didn't really like intimidating people, but it was awfully effective for certain purposes, wasn't it? Are you all right, Lethalin? You are covered in blood. Finn dropped his hand. Some of it is theirs. Mila thrust a potion into his hand, and Finn gladly gulped it down. More healing was good. Leliana peeked inside the hospice. You took out all those guards on your own? I would have liked to see that. The bard gave him a pouting look. I'm never around when you do interesting things. Finian let himself smile. I was just on the other side of the door. Maybe if you were more effective at seducing guards. She smiled back. Why, I am a sister of the Chantry. I would never try such a thing. Good, because you're apparently bad at it. I think you would be surprised, she said with a wink. That can't have been all the prisoners, Mila interrupted, giving them both quelling looks for having gotten off track. I was under the impression a great deal more than that had been taken in. Finn deflated immediately. There had. The other prisoners said that my father had been taken out this way at some point. They must be storing the majority of the elves in a different spot. It would have to be large, and probably have good access to the bay, Leliana said thoughtfully. And abandoned, of course. Finian, can you think of any place like that? He shook his head, at a loss. After a massacre and a plague? There are probably more abandoned buildings here than not, and Maker's Spit, that's a depressing thought. Mila's hand fell hard and firm on his shoulder. We will find them, Lethalin. Come on, Leliana said. Let us get Zevran and begin the search. Finian nodded. I'll need my armor, I think, but first. He glanced back at the hospice. Mila, could you search for tracks? Carting that many elves has got to leave marks. Leliana, would you mind heading back to my PL, my father's, and grabbing my leathers? Leliana shook her head vehemently, grinning. Oh no. You're about to do something interesting again. It is my duty as a bard to watch you do it. I'm covering you. Finn nodded to that, part amused and part glad to have the support. Then, he disengaged from the women and headed back into the hospice. He skittered around the downed Teventers, his fingers twitching as he spotted purses and jewels, but he couldn't take the time to loot. Not when his father needed him. That thought steeled him as he paused at the front door. He released his daggers once, then resheathed them, checking that all the gore from the previous fight hadn't clogged the spring mechanism. No, still as fast as ever. Good. He waited a minute, to give Leliana a good vantage point. Then, he calmly reached out and opened the front door. The healers were still talking to the crowd. Finian didn't pause long enough for anyone to register his presence before he'd sidled up to the nearest guard and punched a dagger into his throat above the gorget with his left hand while simultaneously stealing the guard's sword out of its scabbard with his right. The guard slumped, and Finian had a new sword, all in one swift motion. The elves who had seen this had gone deathly silent, staring at him. The healers noticed and began to turn, but not before Finian had thrown his left-hand dagger into one mage's chest. More than the injury, the dagger's paralyze rune activating stopped the mage from reacting. The other started casting, only to be interrupted by a timely arrow from somewhere on the nearby rooftops. Finian tried swinging the sword once, just out of curiosity, and wrinkled his nose at how slow and unwieldy even a long sword was. He immediately tossed it in Zevran's direction. The crow caught it deftly, having just left his previous sword in the body of a guard. Zev flashed Finian a grin, then dove gleefully into the slaughter. The healer that Finn had thrown the dagger at removed the offending weapon and tossed it aside, his face twisted in anger. Treacherous elf! He cried, then raised a hand and fire burst at him. Finn had known testy mages long enough by now to anticipate the spell, and so he rolled to the side, most of the fire bouncing off his back in his roll. He bounced to his feet brandishing his remaining dagger, which he swiftly put to use in the healer's side. The mage sent a burst of ice in his direction, and Finian cried out as his limbs stiffened in reaction. He was too slow to dodge the pulse of pure force the mage sent out, and he went tumbling to the ground. The mage started firing up a larger spell, but stuttered to a stop as a sword came through his back, followed swiftly by an arm reaching around to run a dagger across his throat. The mage toppled, revealing a smiling Zev behind him. And so the dashing hero swoops in to save the day. I do believe, my dear, that makes you the damsel in distress. The rest of the battle was dying down, only 2 guards remained, and the alienage elves seemed to be happy enough to take care of them themselves. Still kicked your butt, though. Some hero. Finian smirked and climbed to his feet. The strength of the hero is always in the one telling the tale, my warden. Finian raised an eyebrow to that, but they were interrupted by approaching steps. Mila appeared from behind the hospice, her bow slung across her back. I believe I have found the tracks you spoke of. We should go after these Shemlin immediately. Not just humans, Mila, Lelyana said gently, appearing from the opposite end of the square. There was an elf, too, remember? No matter what race, they are evil and must be stopped. Mila gave Lelyana a long, stony look, but then slowly nodded. As soon as I'm properly armed and armored, we'll go, Finn said. I've got your armor. Shiani appeared from the chaos, a familiar bundle of leather in her arms and her face hard set. He didn't like that look on her face. You're not coming with. They're my people too, cousin, she said, handing Finian his leathers. All of us want to figure out what's going on. This was never a hospice, was it? No. Finn took his armor and began strapping it on over the ruined linens. It never was. Let us help. Valandrian went in there, Finn. This was echoed by other elves around the alienage. Finian looked around and noticed that the last of the guards had gone down, and many of the elves looked raring for a fight. Several of the hospice prisoners had rejoined their family and friends. Faces all around were bleak. Finian didn't answer right way, silent as he and Zev put his armor on. Once he was properly dressed for a fight, he walked to his lost dagger and snapped it back into its sheath. He straightened and turned to the crowd. These were his old friends and neighbors, now they looked at him with mixed apprehension and awe. He couldn't let anyone else be hurt for this. He chuckled. You know, the elven spirit is an amazing thing sometimes. When I left, you were all complacent, living meekly in this cage, happy just not to be bothered. Then, I messed it all up. I called the nobles' attention to us, and that led to all this, and I wasn't even around for it. I can't change what happened, and I can't fix it, and I'm not going to apologize for it. But I can sure as the fade fight for you in your time of greatest need. You were strong enough to come this far. I'll do the rest. One by one, they nodded their approval, until Shiani stepped up and hugged him. Good luck. Murmurs, nearby. The rest of the elves echoing the sentiment. Finn could only nod his thanks and let Mila lead him off. 82 on properly equipping your berserker. They were finally going all the way to Branka, and it was about nug-thumping time. Not that Okaren blamed the kid for waiting for backup, no. That was the main reason the warrior hadn't run off and gone all on his lonesome years ago, what with being just sane enough to realize what a sodding death trap the place was. Unlike his wife and her entire house, apparently. As far as Okaren was concerned, more wardens meant a better chance of making it to her and back with his skin intact, unless Branka decided to flay him himself when he dragged her home. Heh, crazy bitch. Damn, he missed her. But still, it felt good to finally be on the move after so many years of waiting. Even if Braska and Lady Marnan did bicker like a pair of married old Ayla makers. Irresponsible to give him any more authority, you must realize this. He'll turn the entire assembly on its head. Maybe that's what I want, princess. Ever thought of that? Okaren was a little worried, honestly, seeing just what kinds of wardens Ferelden had to offer. Kids, all of them. There was the golden boy kid who was some sort of angsty fancy pants, there was the smarta pants kid who was a real blabbermouth, and there was the twitchy twiggy kid. Okaren was pretty sure that, at the twig's age, he'd still been learning how to swing his axe. The ex-princess was the only one of the lot he'd have put any confidence behind, but whatever. They were going after Branka, so he'd take whatever help he could get. What you're advocating is civil war. Marnan had been marching with the rest of them, but she whirled on the duster now. The rest of the wardens stopped walking as well, all sighing with different levels of frustration. Belen has always been prone to grand ideas and strange ideals. It may bode well for your kind, but the rest of Orzammer will not sit quietly and let such things happen. Not without a fight. Garrod crossed his arms defensively. And just what is my kind exactly? You know exactly what I'm referring to. Say it. Go on. Marnan sputtered for a moment, then spun on her heel and started forward again. I don't need to justify myself to you. That works both ways, princess. If you don't got to justify it, then I don't either. Marnan threw her hands in the air in frustration. He murdered his own brother and father, and blamed the former on me and the latter on his political rival. What more proof do you need that he's evil? And what's the alternative, then? Sodding stasis? Harrowmont is all about the Old Blood Club. He'll let Orzammer suffocate on its own tradition, you mark me. That's evil, by my reckoning. Marnan responded, of course, but the rest of them stopped listening as Morrigan groaned, must they really carry on in such a manner? Twiggy watched them with narrowed eyes. It's like being back at the circle, listening to the loyalists arguing with the libertarians. How annoying. Felicity cast Twiggy a curious look. I would have thought you would sympathize with the libertarians, Khazar. You kidding? I don't care squat for politics. He huffed. I just want to burn Darkspawn. Wasn't Uldred a libertarian? Golden Boy asked Felicity. Felicity nodded. They're not all necessarily that extremist, of course. But the divide among the College of Enchanters does lead to some interesting political treatises. The witch made an incredulous noise. I fail to see how a collection of theoretical drivel and so much air could ever be interesting. Action is interesting. It is such things that drive action, Morrigan, Percival said firmly. Words can cause wars, and stop them. Are not the treaties we currently pursue such a case? And see where it has led us, delving into the deep roads with nary an idea where we are going save by the word of this creature. Okaren realized belatedly that the witch was referring to him. Bah, he'd been called worse. I know exactly where we're going. Keep your panties on. He paused and chuckled. Or better yet, don't. One more word out of you and I am turning you into a toad. Okaren belched, to show how much he thought of that. In all honesty, Morrigan, Goldie said mildly, I suspect a toad might be an improvement. You have a better suggestion? Shall I turn him into a mouse instead? Goldie considered it. No, still a step up. A slug. Closer. Really, you two, Felicity cut in. It is such threats of transfiguration that promote superstition about mages among the uninitiated. Percy, you should have more manners than that. The witch crossed her arms under her fine rack. Are you implying that I should not? Well, you did grow up in a forest, so it would stand to reason that your civil skills are underdeveloped. Ha ha, yeah. Okaren brayed. Come join me on the crass end of the pond. Ugh. Morrigan wrinkled her nose. I would rather have my toenails pulled out one by one. In other news, Khazar cut in. Percy has a sense of humor. Who knew? Goldie cast Twiggy a dark, very non-humorous look, and Okaren didn't bother to stifle a guffaw. The look swung to him, but they were interrupted from further conversation by the wardens all tensing at the same time and looking around the walls. Incoming, Marnan said, like it wasn't obvious. The skittering of a dozen feet echoed through the tunnels ahead, and Okaren drew his axe and took a swig from his Alaskin for luck. Yeah. Time for some action. They came out of the tunnels hard and fast, heh. A wave of them came in, and the wardens met the buggers with a wave of their own. Marnan led the charge, and Okaren fell gleefully in behind her, with a Cunary, a Goldie, and a dog all coming in with him. He met a Hurlock with his axe, and the squelch of its insides squishing were just what the healer ordered after 2 years of sitting on his hands doing nothing. He let loose the grip he always kept on his frustration and anger, and slipped into a full-on rage like a long-lost pair of trousers. The tunnels went red, and he gleefully dove into the melee with his weapon swinging. Splork. Down goes Mr. Hurlock. Splosh. Sit, Genlock, sit. Gurgle gurgle squish. And now your insides are your outsides, emissary. He was kinda aware of the others, in that way that you were in a rage, where you only registered them in that, oh yeah, Don't kill that person, Wei. Sten was nearby, lopping off heads like a pro, while Marnan kept calling more of the spawn to her, which was weird, because usually that was the Sordan boarder's job. But nope, Goldie was tearing through the back line with more ferocity than his dog. That startled Okaren right out of his raging, and he stopped and gave Kausland a good look. Huh. If he didn't know better. A genlock jumped him from behind. Whoops, right. Killing stuff. Okaren whipped around and skewered his attacker, and Felicity's healing magic made up for his loss of focus. Not that focus in battle was ever Okaren's thing. Or avoiding damage, actually. She meant well. The fight didn't last long, anyway. One last fireball detonated, and Sten splattered a genlock against a wall, and then they were done. Okaren found himself feeling pretty refreshed after their little bout. Which meant that he turned his head and saw just how the Golden Boy had to take a second after the battle to get his head back together. His suspicion from before clicked into place, and he threw back his head and laughed. Twiggy looked at him dubiously. Garrot, though, smirked as the party wiped the tainted blood off their weapons. Something funny, old man. Yeah, I'll say. You, Goldie. The boy in question looked at him uncertainly. It's Percival. Whatever. You got no idea what ya are, do ya, Goldie? I know what I am, I'm a warden. Nah. Okaren laughed again at the boy's indignant look. You're a berserker, kid. The way you lost your head in the fight, that's a rage. Never seen a human do that before, then again, ain't seen many humans. This piqued the boy's interest. He finished wiping his sword and closed the distance between them, intensity in his eyes. You know why I'm so angry when I fight? Do you know how to stop it? Ha! Stop it? Kid, you should nurture it. Semir, show me that toothpick you use as a weapon. Okaren stood his axe up in the mud and gestured for the sword. Percival hesitated, but Okaren grunted impatiently, and he handed it over. Now gimme that board. After glancing around at their companions, Percival unhooked his shield and also gave it to Okaren. Okaren heft the pair for a moment. Then, he flung them aside. Hey! That rage Okaren had identified flashed in the human's eyes. Flimsy little toys. Okaren hefted his axe and tossed it to the boy, who caught it with a grunt. Give that a few swings, now while you're still riled. Percival glared. Shall I imagine I'm chopping you in half? That's my family's sword you just threw into a wall. Go for it, if it helps ya rage. The boy grit his teeth, then turned his back on Okaren and gave the axe a hefty, angry swing, stumbling a bit from the unfamiliar weight of the weapon. Okaren nodded. It was rough, but a berserker wasn't supposed to be graceful, was he? You think he should use a two-handed weapon? Marnan asked curiously, stepping up beside him. Good tactical head on her shoulders, this one. He was trained on a sword and shield. A good rager is wasted on a shield, Okaren said with a snort. We're good at killing, fast, messy, and brutal. Can't do that if we're hiding half our strength behind a sodding shield. Marnan nodded thoughtfully, then stepped toward the boy, who was still testing the weight of the weapon in his hands. She drew her own axe. Percy, up for a bit of a spar. The human nodded, and the two turned to face one another, the other wardens clearing enough room around the pair to afford them a decent sparring ring. Garrot moved over to Okaren's side, sitting down on a stone while he watched the fight. Anyone wanna make bets? Twiggy leaned back against Garrot's rock on his other side. Come on, the elf said. Percy's got no clue what he's doing with that thing. His point was proven a moment later as the human misjudged the range of the axe, whiffing a blow against the dwarf. It's gonna be Marnan. I'll take that bet, Garrot said with a rumbling chuckle, extending his hand. Loser washes the darkspawn crap off the winner's shoes. The elf snorted and shook his hand once. You're on. They settled down to watch the sparring match, which the princess really did seem to have the upper hand on. She had the experience, after all. The smartpants and the witch were on the other side of the circle, looking fretful and amused, respectively. The Cunary was off to the side, watching attentively. Then, Garrot hopped off his seat and cupped his hands over his mouth. Hey pretty boy. Where's Howat these days? Okaren laughed as that proved to be a trigger. Heat flared up in the human's eyes, and he threw himself at his opponent with all the unbridled fury of the best dwarven warriors. He lunged right into Marnin's axe, throwing her off guard, and knocked her on her ass with 2 swift, brutal strokes. The cavern was silent and still as the human stood over her, catching his breath and shaking off the burst of rage. Then, Garrot and Okaren both whooped in laughter. What did I say? Okaren laughed. Berserker. He offered his flask to Garrot, who raised it in toast and took a sip. Ah, crud, the elf groaned. He's still inexperienced with it, Felicity said. He was taught with the sword. Would equipping him with a great sword help the transition at all? Perhaps, Marnin said, picking herself up. What do you think, Percival? The human shrugged, still playing with Okaren's axe. It does seem a lot easier to handle one of these when I'm raging. Yep, Okaren said. Sten. Marnin said, turning to the Cunary. Might we test his talent with your great sword? Do what you will, the Cunary said, tossing the sword at Percival's feet. It's too small for me anyway. Lovely, being provided Cunary cast-offs, Percival muttered. Even so, he handed the axe back to Okaren and hefted the 2-handed sword. He and Marnin faced off again. As they began trading their first swings of this match, Garrot called out to the Cunary. I hate to say it, big guy, but you're probably not gonna find much bigger here. We're kinda in dwarf territory. Any 2-handed weapon will suffice, for now. Good thing he wasn't picky, all they had was darkspawn weapons, at the moment. Felicity spoke up. Once we leave, we will be able to equip you properly. Come to think of it. She turned to address Garrot, whatever happened to those oversized weapons you found at Lake Callanhood? Okaren was looking in the right direction to see the Cunary stiffen. Wait, what? The elf asked. You found weapons at the Circle Tower. I recall those, Marnin spoke up, her and Percival now leaning on their weapons in rest. They were indeed large. You said you got them off a battlefield. Were they Cunary? Garrot shrugged. It was getting dark. I couldn't tell. And then, Sten was suddenly on top of Garrot. The gigantic man yanked the dwarf in the air by his collar and slammed him against the wall, a good 3 feet off the ground. Where are the weapons? Whoa, whoa. Garrot cried out. Easy, we'll get you something your size. I don't care about that, the Cunary said. The weapons you stole from that field, where are they? This was the first time Okaren had seen Garrot honestly fearful. Whatever he was seeing in the Cunary's eyes apparently scared the bravado right out of him. I sold em. In Ostagar. Sten dropped the dwarf in the dirt and turned away, his face blank. Then we will go to Ostagar. Well, now, Morrigan said with some amusement. That is something of a long trip, for a simple weapon. Felicity made a noise as if to speak. She was looking at the Cunary thoughtfully. Then she seemed to decide to go ahead and say whatever she wanted to. I've read accounts, the Cunary carry personal blades. It's some sort of spiritual significance. Sten, you were one of the Cunary on that field, weren't you? The Cunary didn't answer right away, just stared at the girl. Then, I was. So one of the weapons Garrot took was your sword? Yes. Felicity nodded in understanding. We'll get it back. Again, Sten stared at her. Then, he nodded almost gratefully. Marnin looked amused. Nice to see you making decisions for all of us. Percival shook his head. One of us took something important from one of our companions. It is our duty to get it back. Marnin shrugged. Very well. Sten, as soon as we're done here, we'll head back toward Ostagar. Sten nodded, his eyebrows raised in thought as he considered Marnin in silence. Stone, but Okaren wished he knew what that guy was thinking sometimes. It is the right thing to do, Marnin continued. Wouldn't you agree, Garrot? Yeah. Don't be preachy, princess. In the meantime, the witch said. 'Tis getting a bit rank in this cavern. Now that we've established the importance of proper weapons amongst warriors, may we move on? I'm with the foxy witch, Okaran said, replacing his axe on his back and starting toward the cavern's exit. If you even try it, dwarf, I am turning you into a fly and squishing you. Heh, kinky. 83 Meanwhile, back at the inn. Alistair yawned as he made his way back up from the inn commons. Breakfast had been hearty, if a bit lonely, and Alistair was still working on his last piece of ham. He hadn't bothered to put his armor on, no one had been around when he'd woken up to make him, so whatever. He wasn't going to wear that Templar armor any more than he had to. He could practically hear Felicity scolding him for being so careless, in Loghain's city no less. The thought made him smile as he pushed through the door back into his inn room. That smile faded at the sight of the stern elderly woman in his room, regarding him with an expression that suggested he'd just been caught stealing cookies. Out of reflex, Alistair hid his last bit of ham behind his back. Alistair, Wynne said, and the warden felt inexplicably anxious. Do you know where the others disappeared to? Well, that wasn't too bad a question. He shrugged and popped the last of the ham into his mouth. I can't say. Finn and Zevran were gone when I woke up. As were Mila and Leliana. Did either of them tell you where they'd be going? Nope. Maybe they went shopping. In their armor, Alistair. At that, he looked around and noticed for the first time that the elves' armor was nowhere to be found. He didn't see their weapons or packs either, though that wasn't strange, since both elves tended to carry concealed daggers in public. Wynne sighed. So you didn't have any part in their disappearance? Apparently not. Alistair paused. I wonder why they didn't take me with. Alistair. Well, I have to figure I'm not sneaky enough or something. Wonder what they were doing, that they just took the sneaks. A very disturbing answer popped into his head. They'd snuck off in the middle of the night, in Denerim, with the assassin. Oh no, they wouldn't. Though, after that whole mess back in Redcliffe, Alistair wasn't so sure what Finn and Mila were capable of anymore. But come on. Leliana? She was a Chantry sister, for Andraste's sake. She couldn't possibly have any part in the assassination of major political figures. Wynne rubbed her eyes. Perhaps they merely wished to track down Brother Genitivy in a stealthy way. Right, sure. Maybe that's it. Still, why did he have a feeling of foreboding all of a sudden? There was a clatter from the courtyard outside, and Alistair moved to the window. He could see the stable behind the inn, including the 3 grim-faced guardsmen who walked into the yard. Well, that can't be good. What? Wynne poked her head out the window, then pulled Alistair away from it. This cannot be a coincidence. Your armor, hurry. The elder ran back to her own room, and Alistair tried to do what he could to be quick about attaching a hulking metal suit to his limbs. In the end, Wynne had to come back in full Chantry mother mode and finish up. Alistair could hear shouts downstairs now. The helmet, quickly. He obediently strapped his helmet on and lowered the visor. Wynne thinned her lips. Let us hope our disguises can pass muster so easily without Finian's oversight. Alistair nodded, grabbing his bag and strapping on his sword belt. The pair of them headed down the stairs to see a group of guards harrowing the innkeeper. The guards waved a couple pieces of paper in his face, and Alistair was pretty sure he saw his own face on one of them. This, here, was pretty much the opposite of good. Mother Wynne bowed respectfully to the guards as they passed. They stopped bothering the innkeeper to salute in return. The innkeeper, for his part, looked worried and confused, but he wasn't pointing directly at them, so Alistair wasn't about to complain. Good man. Alistair kept dutifully at the mage's heels as they walked calmly out the door. They headed out onto the street, when turning them toward the Chantry. This is bad, Alistair said, once they'd put some distance between them and the inn raid. We need to somehow warn the others that the inn isn't safe. Nowhere is safe. Did you see? They had drawings. This is so very bad. Just keep your helmet on for now. We must somehow warn the others. There has to be something we can do. Alistair paused as they reached the Chantry, his eyes drawn to the 2 women by the chanter's board, one shouting hilariously mangled food-related verses of the chant. Hey Wynne. How's your memory of the chant? 84 His mother's son. Someone was crying, but most of them were just silent and numb, watching the foreigners count them and sort them like cattle. Syrian had lost track of how long he'd been in a cage now, 2 days, perhaps 3. They'd healed his cough, certainly, but no doubt only to make him more suitable for whatever purposes they intended. His son had been in a cage once for about this long. It made him wonder whether Finian had been forced to endure the sneering jeers, the looks of condescension, the utter lack of privacy for even the most basic functions. It was all dehumanizing on a level that even Syrian had never quite known before. No wonder his boy had grown so restless after that whole ordeal. The elves were lined up in cages along the walls of a broad room deep in the old warehouse. There were a good dozen elves in all, with room for more. Usually, it was just guards in here, feeding them and keeping them cowed. But something was happening now. First, a messenger ran through from the alienage side of the warehouse. Then, guards started dashing back and forth in both directions. Then, one stumbled past from the alienage side, an arrow in his shoulder and blood seeping from a number of puncture wounds. "What's going on?" one of the young elves asked tentatively, only for a guard to bash a gauntleted hand against the bars of his cage. Syrian grit his teeth, schooling himself to patience. And then, the dockside doors burst open and the head of the operation himself swept into the room, Tevinter mage robes flaring and a contingent of armored men at his heels. He turned to survey the elves, and then sighed. "It will have to do. Get the cages loaded. No matter how this ends, we will likely be sailing before night falls." There were two-handed rolling carts in one corner. They'd only managed to load the first cage on it, the one with the small boy and his mother, before the door at the opposite end of the chamber burst open, and 4 figures stepped out onto the raised walkway. Syrian caught his breath, at first thinking that he'd gone mad, seeing Adaya stride into the room, all decked in leather and covered in blood. But then, the lead rescuer smiled dangerously at the Tevinter leader and said, "You must be Caladrius. We need to have a talk about your business model." Syrian's heart started pounding even faster. That wasn't Adaya, it was Finian, and dear maker, what was the boy getting himself into now? His son's companions didn't inspire much more confidence. They were all dressed lightly in leathers and carrying, at best, bows and a sword. That, against twice as many men much more heavily armored? Ah, so it is elves that are causing such a disruption. I might have guessed. The Tevinter turned his attention fully to the intruders, obviously coming to the same conclusions that Syrian did. "I suppose we knew this little arrangement wouldn't last forever. And who might you be?" Finian sketched a bow, as cheeky before authorities as he had ever been. "I am Finian Tabri of the Grey Wardens, and these are my companions, Mila, Zevran, and Lelyana. It appears, my good man, that you've accumulated something that doesn't belong to you. Several somethings, in fact. We're here to kindly ask that you return them." "A Grey Warden, The Tevinter didn't seem the least bit perturbed. If anything, he was even more amused. "Now that is a surprise. You know, the Regent speaks the name of your order like a man cursing the greatest demons of the Fade. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised to find you interfering here." At that, Finian arched a brow. He leaned casually on the banister separating their raised walkway from the rest of the room, but Syrian knew both the boy and his mother well enough to recognize the dagger sheaths strapped to his forearms. Maker, he'd hoped Finian would never come to this, but the boy had always been his mother's son. "So it's our dear Regent behind your little operation? And here we figured it was just one particularly ambitious Arl. They did seem fairly close when I met them, my warden," one of Finian's companions put in cheerfully through an Antivan accent. Perhaps condoning slavery was something they thought to bond over, like card games or a particularly talented prostitute. Finian chuckled. "So tell me, Caladrius, what does Loghain get out of this? Money? Tevinter support? A problem made to just go away?" "I suppose he sees a bit of all of the above," Caladrius said with a casual shrug. "Though I can't claim to speak for the latter two. Gold certainly does speak a long way even in your backwards court, and that is all that matters to us." "I'd gathered as much." Finian stood up straight, and a dagger appeared in his hand as if by magic. He twirled it. "See, that's where I think we might run into a bit of a problem, here. We shan't, depending on how reasonable you are, my dear warden." The Tevinter strode a couple steps toward them, unimpressed. Syrian, however, was noticing how the guards were getting ready for a fight. Truth be told, there was always a limit on how long we could operate here. We're paying for Loghain's troops now, but sooner or later, we will become inconvenient. I have heard that your order are running into a bit of trouble with your dear regent. I think we can help one another out. And what kind of help would we want from a Tevinter slaver? Oh, you'd be surprised how well money talks, though I wouldn't expect an elf to understand. The Tevinter paced for a moment, then apparently came to a decision and turned to the wardens with a smile. Tell you what, 100 sovereigns from you and allow me to leave with my remaining slaves. Syrian saw Finian's grip on his dagger tighten, and I give you a letter with the seal of the Terran of Guerin implicating him in all of this, for you to present to any potential allies that you please. A fair trade for cutting my business here short, don't you think? One of the women behind Finnehuman, Syrian realized, sidled up and whispered something in the boy's ear, only for the Antivan to furrow his brows and mutter into his other. Finian, for his part, didn't drop his smile, and the fourth member of their party stayed back, hard eyes never leaving Caladrius. Finally, Finian shook his head and waved both his companions off. An interesting offer, but I've got a counter. 200 sovereigns, and you leave without the letter or the elves. Syrian's eyes nearly bugged out of his head. Where had the boy gotten 200 sovereigns? Oh, Finian. Oh, no, that won't do. Caladrius glanced back at their cages like a fond kennel master surveying his hounds. Without them, this trip simply wouldn't be profitable, would it? But I can be generous. Keep the money. I shall give you the letter for free and be on my way with my profits and my property. Finian shook his head, looking almost apologetic. Alas, it seems we are at an impasse. I can't let you take the elves, and you refuse to leave without them. Indeed, the Tevinter sighed. And I was so hoping we could resolve this without resorting to barbarism. Caladrius raised his hand to signal his men to attack, but Antivan drew something from his pocket and hurled it in front of the walkway, obscuring the four in a shattering of glass and a waft of smoke. It cleared a moment later, and all four were gone. What? Find them. Caladrius said, raising his voice for the first time. He drew the staff off his back, but an arrow appeared in his arm before he could raise it, and it tumbled to the ground. Syrian thought he spotted a flash of red hair in the doorway. The guards tore up the stairs to the walkway, only for a shadow to emerge from underneath it and fall in step behind them. The first guard was gutted on a sword and dagger before they even registered its presence. Syrian heard whispering behind his cage, and saw Finian and the human girl working their way around behind the Tevinters. He's got 2 guards sticking on him like burrs, the woman whispered in an Orlshian accent. What an eclectic group of characters his son had picked up. Somehow, Syrian did not find that fact surprising. I'll take left, you take right, and we'll hope Mila can keep him from casting long enough to keep me alive. Shall I hum a war chant while you go? If you can find a way not to give away your position, go for it. Finian smirked, but then burst out of hiding, leaping into a double thrust on one of the men guarding Caladrius. Syrian noticed that the boy hadn't looked inside the cages at all. Was he afraid of what he would see, or of what he wouldn't? Syrian admitted that he himself had been saddened to see how many elves had already been shipped to Tevinter, including Sorai's young wife. Finian was dazzling. That grace and nimbleness was Adaea's, no doubt, but the flair he added to every slash and dodge was all the boy's own. When he saw Finn flip over one guard to come down on the other's shoulders, he nearly cheered. Not so much as Caladrius, having regained his staff, shot a bolt at the archer in the doorway that threw her back into the next room, then turned a murderous look to Finian. He raised his arrow-bloodied hand, and a red aura swirled around him. Son, behind you. Syrian called. Finian yanked his dual daggers out of his fallen foe and finally looked up at Syrian. Relief crashed over the boy's face at seeing him, but that second of hesitation cost him dearly. Caladrius raised his arm, and both Finian and the mage's own remaining guard threw their heads back and screamed. The Orlshian woman shot an arrow at the mage that struck true in his back, but that only made the Tevinter laugh. You backwards feral dance. Making a blood mage bleed will only make him stronger. Unless that blood is poisoned, a cheerful voice said from the raised walkway. There, the Antivan and the elven girl stood amidst a circle of guard corpses. The Antivan flashed the Tevinter a very sharp grin and finished applying something to an arrowhead. Then, he handed the arrow to the archer. "Try this one, my dear." The woman nodded, never taking her hard eyes off the mage as she knocked and released. Caladrius took a couple steps back, but the arrow landed directly in the center of the man's chest. Whatever was on that arrow, it must have been awful, because the mage started shrieking and clutching at his chest. He fell back to the ground, twitching and cursing in the Tevinter tongue. Antivan and Archer leapt over the banister, running to help pick Finian off the floor. "Are you all right, Lethalin?" the woman asked. "Fine," Finian said, shuddering. "Though for future reference, having your blood boil in your veins is not a pleasant sensation." "Is that what he was doing?" the Antivan said, looking thoughtfully down at the still twitching mage. "Then I suppose this must be something of a taste of his own poison, as the saying goes." Finn moved to stand over the mage. "Was there a paralyzation agent in that poison, Zev?" "Of course. Wouldn't want our wily mage to wiggle his fingers when we try to question him, would we?" Finian nodded. "Mind holding him down?" The Antivan's grin bordered on disturbing. "Do I get to be the scary one for once?" "Yeah, Zev. You're going to be the scary one." Finn looked up at his two other companions. The human inspected the corpses, while the elven woman stood over her, watching both exits attentively. As Syrian watched, the human produced a keyring from a guard's belt and headed for the nearest cage. The rescue, it seemed, had been a success. Syrian wasn't the only one to sigh in relief. "Wakey wakey, slaver scum." Finian's voice drew Syrian's attention back to the blood mage. The Antivan was now behind the prone mage, kneeling on his shoulders and with a dagger to his throat. Finian stood over him, slapping him lightly. It must have been quite a sight, coming to with the sight of two blood-stained elves grinning sharply down at you. "I've thought of a new offer," Finian said silkily, and Syrian was appalled to hear that hard edge in his son's voice. "Would you like to hear it?" Caladrius swallowed, eyes darting between the two elves. He seemed to have difficulty moving his lips. "I would be open to it. You get out, now. Leave the letter, leave the elves. Or, I let my crow here do whatever he wants to your slaving ass, and I eventually let him kill you out of the mercy in my heart." Caladrius's eyes darted up to reassess the Antivan, who was now grinning in what could only be described as an "I am going to enjoy hurting you" manner. Syrian was reeling a bit himself. His son, traveling with a crow? Maybe that explained the hardness in Finian's expression, but Syrian doubted it. "That's my final offer, Caladrius. Your choice." Very well. You win. The letter's in my robes, take it." Finian smoothly stooped down and rifled through the man's pockets. He came up with a sealed letter and a couple coins beside. He flashed the coins at the Tevinter before pocketing them. "Get him out of here." "My pleasure." Zevran grabbed the mage by the injured arm and dragged him out the dockside door. The crow seemed to enjoy making the paralyzed mage bump into things. Finian turned to the human, who had unlocked all the cages without Syrian realizing it. Carefully, the other elves stepped out of the kennels. "Leliana, we need to go through the offices. Look for paperwork, ledgers, anything. The more we can find against Howe and Loghain, the better." The human nodded and disappeared after the crow. The elven woman moved to stand guard at the alienage side doorway, and only then did the newly released elves feel free to approach their prodigal savior. Syrian remembered well the unrest after his boy's abrupt conscription, the madness of young elves revolting, and older elves blaming the young. The name Finian Tabri had been a curse just weeks ago, but Syrian doubted it would be any longer. Finian met Syrian's eyes, and before either knew it, the elder elf had met his son in an exuberant hug. "If your mother could see you now," he whispered proudly, and Finn hugged him tighter for a moment before letting go completely. "Valandrian? Is he here?" Syrian shook his head sadly. "He was sent on an earlier ship. This is all that's left of us here." Finian's eyes widened in horror as he looked around at their depleted numbers. "What? Then the rest of them?" "No, Lethalin," the elf in the doorway spoke up, also looking saddened by this news. "We cannot chase them down. The blight. I know. Finian shouted so suddenly that the alienage elves jumped. The boy turned and paced a couple steps, rubbing his face. But, slavery, Mila. The Harin, my cousin's wife. Maker's striped stockings, this is a nightmare. Even if you follow them, my warden, the Antivan said, striding through the door with the Orlshian right behind him, you will not find them easily. They'll have been scattered and sold by now. He shook his head, and the look in his eye left no doubt in Syrian's mind that this man was a killer. Say what you like about the Imperium, their slave trade is very efficient. But hard to track, the Orlshian sighed. No paperwork, other than the letter in your hand. They must have destroyed everything when they detected us coming. Finian's pacing was getting increasingly agitated. He had never liked the idea of anyone being trapped, after that incident with the noble boy. No one blames you, Finian, Syrian tried. You did an amazing job in just freeing those of us here and putting a stop to the operation. It was more than we could have hoped for. But if I'd just been here, Finian said. If I hadn't joined the wardens. Then you would have been executed for the murder of Banvon, Syrian said calmly. You see. The Antivan said with a bit more cheer. No good for anyone. Syrian realized this must have been a discussion they'd had before. Syrian turned dubiously to the crow, surprised to be of one mind with an assassin. I have to admit, Finian, your associations have always been dubious, but do the wardens know you've got an Antivan crow in your company? It's not exactly something I've written to Weishaupt about, no. And there was the Finian Syrian remembered, smiling bashfully, with just a hint of mischief. Ah. As long as you know what you're doing, son. I don't, really. But if it helps, I'm really good at improvisation. When it doesn't get me arrested or killed. The Antivan laughed, and Syrian decided he wouldn't berate his son for his choice in companions, not when they'd apparently made such a good team. As the four turned to start heading out of the warehouse, Syrian fell into step beside them. And who are these fine ladies, then? Oh, right. Father, this is Mila Mahariel, a fellow warden, and Lelyana, a chantry sister who's been helping us. Guys, this is my father. Lelyana giggled. Well, we had figured that out on our own. Syrian whispered conspiringly, both quite pretty, wouldn't you say? To his surprise, both Lelyana and Zevran burst out laughing at that. Mila, however, glanced anxiously at Finian, and Finian himself bit his lip. Actually, father. The boy reached back and pulled the crow to his side. The other man looked surprised but not unpleasantly so as Finn wrapped an arm around his waist. There's something we should probably discuss. Syrian took another look at the Antivan. The man was talented, obviously, and he had the sort of face that would get all the alienage girls swooning and many human girls at that. But there was more to it. Now that he looked closer, there was a certain protective way the crow held himself over Finian, and the guarded, analyzing expression with which he watched Syrian spoke of intelligence and caution in equal measure. Valandrian had never revealed much about the nature of Finian's imprisonment at a noble estate all those years ago, but Syrian had wondered. At an age when Sorais had been bumbling over every cute girl he came across, Finn had been practicing climbing the buildings around the alienage and picking pockets in the market. When Valandrian had told him there had been an incident with a noble's son, but he'd dismissed his suspicions when Finn never came forward about it. That his son had never felt confident enough to tell him about this made him sad, but then again, it spoke volumes about how much his boy had grown, that he was willing to broach the topic now. Syrian nodded and smiled, placing a hand on his son's shoulders. And we will. But first, I think I will have to invite you and your companions to lunch. It's the least I can do. He nodded a special thanks toward the crow, because Finian was the kind of boy who needed an eye kept on him, and he could only assume the crow was the one to do it. The crow smirked, seeming to come to his own conclusions about Syrian, and nodded back. And then, he let the wardens lead him and the other elves along the winding route out of the warehouse, into sunlight again. 85 The Wicked Witch? Ruck was unnerving to deal with, so Percival was glad Marnan did all the talking. The twisted dwarf kept referring to the sweet song and the darkness within. It was an arrow that hit a bit too close to the heart. Percy felt like he hadn't gotten a good night's sleep since his joining because of the taint. Still, as they settled down to camp in a side passage off the Ortentag, Percival couldn't help but be further disturbed by the way the boy reacted when they'd suggested telling his mother they were alive. The warden was so distracted that he couldn't seem to summon the rage for his nightly practice with Ocaran, until the dwarf just shrugged and sat by the fire to drink instead of walking him through maneuvers. This left Percival alone in his contemplation. Garrot called it brooding, sitting with his hound in the dim light at one side of the camp, doing basic maintenance on his armor and weapons. New greatsword notwithstanding, he just couldn't bring himself to neglect his family blade. What kind of son would do that? Was Ruck really that ashamed, that he'd rather his mother thought him dead than know that he yet lived? Did he truly think his mother's grief over his death would be any better? Then again, what would Percy think, if Fergus turned up a ghoul like that, rather than dead? He tried to imagine his brave, fun-loving brother, scavenging in the wilds and turned into a twisted thing. He shuddered at the idea. Part of him thought that, yes, it would be better for the mother to think her son dead than to have her last memories of him tainted by the image of that horrible creature. Could anyone else in their party understand that sort of familial bond? Not Khazar or Felicity, circle-grown as they were. What about Marnan? But no, her familial bonds had seemed political at best. Maybe Garrot, not his mother, but his sister. He'd aligned himself to a snake for her sake, but that may have just been more of an alignment of like preferring like than familial loyalty. Ocaran refused to accept the fact that his wife was probably in much the same condition. Even if they found her as a ghoul and dragged her back, Percy doubted the stubborn dwarf would believe it. Sten never spoke of his family at all. Did Cunary even have families like humans did? And then there was Morrigan and her mother. Percival suspected that, were they to find Flemeth in such a condition, Morrigan would laugh and laugh and laugh. Percival could not understand such antipathy as those two showed for one another. Flemeth may have been a bit rough around the edges, admittedly, so much so that one couldn't tell where the edges were anymore, but she was still Morrigan's mother. Percival's mind went back to the tome, sitting unknown in Felicity's bag. Its existence had been tormenting him ever since he'd stumbled across it. How could silence make him feel so guilty? Was it his right to keep that book's presence from Morrigan? Was it his right to speak it? There was a zap of lightning and raucous laughter from the fireplace, breaking into Percival's thoughts. He glared over at the noise, only to jump as a voice spoke directly above him. You have been polishing that same spot on your chest plate for 5 minutes. Not that this is necessarily a bad thing, as I do not mind seeing my own reflection. As if summoned by his thoughts, she stood over him, peering into his chest plate. Morrigan. The witch arched a brow. You were expecting someone else, perhaps. Go away. Percy turned resolutely back to his armor. True, he'd been making an effort to be more companionable all around, but he couldn't do this right now. Hugo didn't seem to agree. He raised his head up toward Morrigan and whined. The woman took that as invitation, and Percy scowled down at his dog. She settled cross-legged beside him, just watching him clean his armor. After a couple minutes of silence, Percival sighed. What do you want, Morrigan? Why must I want anything? It is either sit here, or sit over there. She waved a hand vaguely toward the campfire. As if to prove her point, Ocaran's voice could be heard drawling something, sending Garrot and Khazar into laughter while Felicity's voice rose in scolding indignation. Percy snorted a reluctant laugh. I see your point. And this is what makes you the sensible one. Percival turned his attention back to his work, overly aware of her continued gaze. She didn't seem to be watching him for any particular purpose, merely for the sake of something to look at. He supposed the upkeep of warrior equipment would be an alien sight for the witch, and a nice change from the dirt and darkness they'd been surrounded with for the last couple days. They sat in silence for some minutes, Percy feeling inexplicably twitchy under her regard. After a while, just to fill up silence, he said, It must be quite a change, going from a life-filled wilderness to a hole in the ground. She seemed surprised by the words. It most certainly is. I wasn't aware that you cared. He snapped a glare up at her. Do you have to make everything into a fight? 'Twas no attempt to fight, 'twas fact, she replied stiffly. You have never previously shown any interest in my wishes or my life, why start now? Why indeed? He should just ignore her. She was trouble on legs, he had no business getting involved with her in any way. He turned back to his work. I find your silence most intriguing. I don't care, he said, somewhat defensively. Then why, pray tell, did you ask? He was honestly not sure. This thing with the book was messing with his head. It burst out of him. Why do you hate your mother? Again, Morrigan seemed surprised, but the curling smile that lit her face a moment later indicated it was a pleasant one. Well, now, that is an interesting question. Why don't you hate yours? What? Percy was so shocked that he forgot his armor altogether. Because she was my mother. She was always there for me, supporting me when I needed it, and scolding me when I needed that as well. Well, suffice to say that mine was not. That can't possibly be true. Can't it? Morrigan arched a brow and leaned forward, giving Percival a spectacular view that reminded him of a certain night back in Lothering. He swallowed. Would your mother have destroyed every trinket or toy you held dear, simply so that she could be the sole recipient of your affections? Would she have kept you in a cottage away from any form of civilization, reliant on her for everything from food to social interactions? Would she have refused to allow you to venture beyond that until such a time as doing so benefited her? Is that the sort of thing a loving, supportive mother would do, Warden? Percival was shocked, but that description explained so much. If you were so aware of what she was doing, why did you stay with her for so long? Being aware of her manipulations is not the same thing as being capable of escaping them. Morrigan sat back with a shrug, as if it were nothing, when it was, in fact, everything. I had no knowledge of the outside world, and I'd met enough Templars who wandered into the wilds after Mother to know what they would do to me as soon as they suspected what I was. But then why did she let you go now? Certainly, traveling with us is teaching you to be self-sufficient. She has to know that you will be able to escape her now. Morrigan hummed thoughtfully. Perhaps she believes that the risk of my defection is worth it, if I achieve what I set out to do. And what would that be? A pause, barely detectable. Why, help stop the blight, of course. Percival snorted. It can't just be that, if she was that obsessed with keeping you leashed. It is, as far as you are concerned. Morrigan sighed. My mother's mind is a strange place. She did not take me in for companionship, as far as I can tell. Well, why did she? If I were capable of understanding the twists of her ill mind, I would have gone insane long ago. Oh come, it can't be that bad. You grew up with her, you must know her mind on some level. Only in that I know it better than any other mere mortal. She threw her hands in the air. Everything she ever shared with me was on her own terms. What little she has told me of her life may very well be fiction. I've had nothing concrete that she did not spoon-feed me herself, so how am I to know truth from falsity? Percival groaned, because it was as if the Maker himself were telling him what to do. It was too much. He turned to Hugo and whispered a short set of orders into the Maberry's ear. Hugo stood and took off at a lope toward the other side of the campsite. The others were too caught up in whatever tale Garrot was telling to notice. Morrigan arched an eyebrow. What, pray tell, was that about? Percival raised his hand in a gesture begging patience. A moment later, the Maberry returned, a big black book clenched firmly in his jaws. Hugo dropped it in Morrigan's lap and panted, looking proud of himself. There was some sort of leaf clipping on his muzzle. Ugh, what is it now, you mutt? Morrigan held the book away from herself so the dog slobber dripped away from her. Then, she blinked and held it closer. Wait, this is Flemeth's grimoire, Percival finished quietly. He watched the camp, but no one had taken notice of the Maberry going through Felicity's herb bag. Small surprise, with how often the dog was caught with his nose in Morrigan's. Morrigan held it close to herself and started going through it. Where on earth? It was in the Circle Tower, apparently. Felicity was keeping it. And she told you about it, it seems, the witch snapped, looking up at him sharply. Yes. Percival bowed his head in acceptance of her anger. I was part of the deception, however small a part, and for that I apologize. Her angry expression faded to something cool and guarded. Then why give it to me now? Because it is your right. Whether you get along with her or not, she is your mother. Whatever is done with that book, it should be your decision. Morrigan ran her hands over the book's cover, the coldness in her expression fading. But what if there are dark magics in here? Surely your maker would object to my learning them. Possibly, but it is not my place to say. Morrigan was quiet for a time, and then started going through the book. Percival found himself watching her, marveling at how the slight furrow of concentration on her brow made her seem so much more human. The way she worried her lip as she flipped through it was the manner of a young woman striving to understand, rather than a witch looking to manipulate. Manipulation, Percy realized, that she must have picked up from Flemeth. How could she be otherwise, when she knew no other way to be? One of her long-fingered hands ran along a strange diagram on one page, her lips mouthing words Percival could not guess. Once again, he was reminded what an exotic specimen of woman she was. Crafted by her mother to be irresistible bait, a shrewd assistant, and a cold woman who rejected any attachment out of hand. But underneath that was curiosity and strength that was fascinating in its draw. His initial attraction to her had been shallow, attracted to her wild beauty and mysterious air. But there was so much more to her than that, and he was shocked to realize that he rather wanted to unwrap this shelled being, to see what sort of creature lay inside. She glanced up at him, her golden eyes catching his, and he startled as he realized he'd been staring. "You are a very strange man," she said. She turned her head and caught his lips in a swift, blazing kiss. He reached for her, but she was gone before his hands got there. Her body and book both disappeared into the cavern darkness in the form of some small furred thing, no doubt to contemplate the tome in solitude. Percival found himself wishing that the kiss had been longer, and that Morrigan had stayed with him. Never before had sitting alone felt so lonely. 86 Going rogue. They waited until nightfall, despite Finian's agitation about the wanted posters and Alistair's lack of knowledge about them. Leliana soothed him by working on his fingering with his lyre. By the end of the day, he and Mila were singing Dalish songs together for the alienage kids. Even she and Zevran joined in, by the third or fourth time through each song. And so, that night, they packed up their fresh non-blood-stained outfits courtesy of the grateful shop owner for clearing the healers off his doorstep, red-on their leather armor, and snuck out of the alienage in the same manner they'd come in, up and over the wall. Leliana was almost said to wave goodbye. She'd met a lot of good people today. She'd never really thought about what it must mean to be separated from the general population like this. She'd always thought that the elves must be safer and happier among their own kind, but that was obviously not true. She couldn't keep believing that, after what she'd seen today. The four rogues hopped off the rooftops and took to the alleys. This meant they ran into a mugging and had to put a stop to it, but it was still safer than the higher-profile running on rooftops craziness of the night before, no matter how much less fun. They were skirting around the market corridor when Leliana heard something that made her pause. Was that a chanter? At this hour? The others noticed her stop. Leliana. Finian prodded. Something wrong? Oh, I really hope not. She worked her way out to see the chantry, because the chanters shouldn't be out working at this hour. It was too dangerous, unless something had happened. Oh, she hoped nothing had happened, not here too. Maker, my enemies are abundant, the chanter was saying, very slowly. Her voice was hoarse, but strong. Many are those who rise up against me. Leliana poked her head out of the alley and gasped, and she heard the others have similar reactions behind her. When? But my faith sustains me, Wynne was saying. She was dressed in her mother's robes, and a Templar looked to be nodding off behind her. I shall not fear the Legion, should they set themselves against me. Oh, that is clever, Zevran whispered appreciatively. Leliana rolled her eyes, but smiled. Silently, she agreed. Should we see how long they can keep this up, or should someone go grab them? Finian asked with a smile. I'll go, Leliana laughed. I'm least conspicuous. The square was pretty much empty at this time of night, but Leliana still carefully timed her casual stroll out of the alley and into the chantry, walking right past the pair, who, to their credit, didn't miss a word of the chant. Leliana grabbed up a bucket and the well and pumped a couple times, then carried her bucket back out, pretending that this was nothing but a late-night emergency well run. She returned to the alley with a bucket of water she wasn't sure what to do with. A moment later, the chant of light stopped filling the square, and Wynne and her Templar escort shuffled into the alley. Alistair ripped off his helmet with a sigh of relief, his hair matted with sweat. "Maker, am I glad Duncan conscripted me?" Leliana offered her water with a smile, and he started gulping it down. Wynne, meanwhile, ran a hand over her throat, her hand briefly glowing blue with healing magic. "I must say, that does take a great deal more lung power than I would have guessed. I shall have to tip chanters better in the future, I think." "Must they really shout it in a public square like that?" Mila asked. "Do the followers not know the words already?" "I don't think they do it for the devout followers, Mila," Finian said with a grin. "Then they intend to annoy and enrage those who do not wish to have chantry teachings shoved down their throats." Mila sounded so indignant that even Leliana stifled a giggle. "It is natural, when you believe something strongly," Leliana said, "to want to share it, no? Is that not why you are so proud of your Dalish tattoos that you refuse to hide them?" "It is hardly the same," the elf said. "My Valislan are what I am, how we dedicate ourselves to the creators. And the chant is how we dedicate ourselves to the Maker. You do not need to accept it, we merely want others to know our joy." Mila seemed to turn that over in her head. "I suppose that seems fair." "Whatever the case," Alistair cut in, "as far as I'm concerned, I'm all joyed out. Do we want to know where you lot have been all day, that we had to stand there and do that for hours?" "Rest assured," Zevran said, "we were up to no good." Wynne looked genuinely worried, so Leliana put in. "We were only checking on Finian's family. That's all." "I see," Wynne said with a relieved sigh. Leliana was tempted to ask what they'd thought they'd been doing. "They were well, I take it." "Not so much." Finian smiled tightly. "I'll fill you in later." "Good idea," Alistair said, setting the bucket aside. "For now, let's get out of here, because, by the way guys, the guards are after us." "I know," Finn sighed. "They put up wanted posters." "Oh, was that what they were waving around?" The group started down the alley, following Finian deeper into the city. "So, which of us has a higher bounty, do you think?" "Alistair," Wynne said in exasperation. Finn chuckled. "Has to be me. I killed a noble, remember?" "Yeah, but I'm a threat to Loghain's regency, remember?" "Oh, good point." "Wait, what do you mean by that?" Leliana asked. Maybe it was the bard in her, but it sounded like there was an interesting secret afoot. Even in the darkness, she could see Alistair flush. "I'm, so good-looking that the court will just have to make me king." Zevran laughed. "Subtlety is not one of your strong suits, my friend." They came out into a street that appeared to be part of a laborer's district, then promptly crossed it into another alley. Finian seemed to be leading them somewhere. Leliana and Zevran both stared at Alistair pointedly as they walked, until the human finally gave a twitch and said, "All right. Fine, I'll tell you. But you have to swear not to tease me about it, Zevran, or so help me you're going to lose those bits of yours that Finn seems so fond of." Zevran nodded sagely. "I will swear it on my eternal love for leather." "Right, well, here's the thing, it's probably largely my fault that Loghain is so big on having us all die as quickly as possible. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I'm the reason he hired you, Zevran. Because you are some sort of threat to his regency." Leliana confirmed, drawing a nod. "The only threat, in fact. I'm kind of..." His voice got really quiet. "King Merrick's bastard son." Leliana gasped, though something old in her was delighted to be privy to such a scandal. The Antivan, meanwhile, laughed. Alistair glared at him. "Remember, not a word. Cross my heart and hope to die, your majestic wardenness." Alistair groaned, and Leliana couldn't stifle her own laughter. "If it is any consolation," Mila said from the back of the group, "I see no point in obsessing over the identity of one's parents. In Dalish society, one's value to the community is judged by what one can do." "Thank you, Mila," Alistair said. "In fact," she went on, "I believe that, were Alistair Dalish, his abilities would not merit him being granted any position of power, much less major leadership of any large number of people. And now I take back my thanks. That means we've got 2 royals in the Wardens, Lelyana said. You and Marnan. You should get together and talk about royal things. I'm not royal. I'm a bastard. I want nothing to do with kings and regencies. I just want to heal Eamon so he can fix everything. And it has not occurred to you, Zevran pressed, that his solution may well involve your bloodline. It has, yeah. I'm just really hoping it doesn't. Lelyana was about to comment on that, but Finian suddenly shushed them from up ahead. They were working their way through a dark alley, buildings towering all around them. Finian looked around anxiously. I thought I heard voices. Mila's eyes were sharper than anyone else's. She pulled her bow with one hand while pointing up to a wooden walkway above them with another. There. An arrow flew through the darkness toward them, lodging in Zevran's shoulder. As the wardens and their companions drew their weapons, a dozen men burst out of the shadows and swarmed them. Lelyana ducked under an overhang as she knocked her bow, trying to find the archer who had hit Zevran. The boys were engaging the melee attackers, and Wynne was quick with getting the arrow out of the crow, but Mila seemed to have spotted the attacker and let fly already. Lelyana followed the elf's gaze and spotted a trio of archers up on the walkway. Lelyana raised her own bow and shot the archer, and Mila shot her arrow while Lelyana knocked her next one. They glanced at one another and smiled and set about alternating shots, giving their target no time to recover as he was pierced by arrow after well-aimed arrow. At last, the first archer went down. Mila nodded her head to the right, and they switched targets to the next archer down the line. However, Lelyana lost her rhythm as something bit into her back. One of the thugs had broken away from the boys. Healing magic washed over her a moment later, but it broke her attention away from the archers. Lelyana ducked a swing of the man's broadsword and scurried out from under the overhang. Mila, apparently noticed the interruption, and turned and shot Lelyana's attacker in the foot, stopping him from following as he stumbled. A moment later, Finian was there, smiling apologetically as he swiped his daggers across the man's throat to finish him. The archers on the walkway saw the opening, and a flurry of arrows came down toward all 3 of them. Lelyana started to dodge away, but one arrow hit her in the back of the knee, going right through the muscle above it. Her leg buckled, useless and in pain, and she collapsed onto her side in the middle of the alley. More arrows thumped around her, and she could only duck her head and hope no more hit, as helpless as she was. A moment later, a presence moved over her, blocking her from the arrows. She looked up, expecting Alistair, but instead saw that it was Mila. The elf had taken a couple arrows herself, most notably a shaft in her hip and a deep cut across the right side of her bared midriff. Still, the Dalish elf stood tall and proud as she stood over Lelyana, steadily knocking arrow after arrow as she shot down the archers. Her hands didn't even shake. Lelyana, downed and in excruciating pain by just the one arrow, was amazed that this small, elegant elven body could possibly hold such strength. The last of the archers fell, and Mila turned her attention to the melee fight. Alistair looked like the spoke of a deadly wheel, surrounded by no less than 5 men who seemed to take turns swiping at his armor. Wynne was right behind them, an aura of healing around her and a drawn expression on her face. She reached into her pouch and fumbled with a blue potion. Zevran and Finn, meanwhile, danced around the outside of Alistair's circle, picking off thugs from the back. As Lelyana watched, Zevran took another down and shouted, "Ha ha! That's 4 for me." Which Finn matched in turn with a twist and a smirk. 5. Lelyana scrambled to lift her own bow to help, but her hands were shaking too much with pain to risk shooting at anything near her friends. With a sigh, she set her bow down and helped in the only way she knew how. She sang, her voice warbling through her pain. "Fly, Warden, fly. On griffin wings. Your armor shines like fire. Your sword and bowstring sing." Zevran, who was already weakened from the arrow wound in his shoulder, took a blow in the back from a great sword and toppled to the ground. Finian savaged his attacker a moment later. "The darkness must fail. You will prevail. Let none stand before you who do not feel your sting." Wynne was exhaustedly trying to fire off what spells she could, but her strength was obviously flagging. Alistair, distracted, took a hammer blow to the head defending her. His helmet crumpled in, and he stumbled. Once he'd dispatched that opponent, Wynne helped him remove the ruined thing and healed him, and he gave her a bashful smile of thanks. Fight, Warden, fight. The final battle here. Bring forth the light. That evil must fear. Mila's bow sang again and again, her arrows releasing in rhythm with Lelyana's song. They will flee once more. As ages before. The Grey Warden's victory draws ever near. Mila's bow twanged one last time, and the last of the attackers fell. It took a moment of them standing in silence for their victory to sink in. Oh, thank the Maker, Finn said, collapsing practically on top of Zevran. The crow chuckled. My warden, I am perhaps unfamiliar with playing the part of the damsel in distress, but I suspect there must be something in the code of a knight in shining armor that involves not sitting upon the mortally wounded. You're not mortally wounded, you baby, Finn said with a smile, even as Wynne rushed to the crow's side to heal the ugly gashes that seeped through his armor. Yes, but claiming it as mortal goes far to score sympathy points, no. Mila, meanwhile, knelt down beside Lelyana, inspecting her knee. You should see to your own wounds, Lelyana pointed out, eyeing the spots still oozing blood on her midriff and thigh. They can wait. The Dalish stood and raised her voice. Harin, I do not believe my poultices will suffice for the Sadasulan's wound. Wynne nodded and rose with difficulty. Alistair had to walk her over to the two archers, and Alistair wasn't looking his best either. He still looked a little dazed. Sadasulan. Lelyana echoed curiously. Mila gave her a considering look. It means singer. I see. Lelyana smiled. It's pretty. I like it. If she didn't know better, Lelyana might think that Mila blushed, just a bit. Once Wynne was kneeling beside Lelyana, she pursed her lips. May I move it, dear? Lelyana swallowed and nodded, and when Wynne carefully moved the knee into a better position to examine, Lelyana had to hold back a scream. By Andraste, it hurt. Oh dear, it's gone right through the muscles above the knee. Even if I were at my full power, I wouldn't be able to heal this well enough for you to walk tonight. Wynne nonetheless began rifling through her healer's kit. We will have to make do with removing the arrow and fixing what we can, for now. We will need a safe place to rest, however. That may prove problematic, I think, Zevran commented drily. Finian was helping him to his feet, but the assassin still looked wobbly. I lost my helmet, Alistair put in thoughtfully. On the one hand, it will be hard to hide without it. On the other hand, I don't have to wear it anymore. I think I'm rather happy about that. You'll be easier to hit on the head, though, Finn said. Then again, it's not like your head is anything of significance. I'll have you know I rather like my head, and Felicity agrees with me, Sonia. Yeah, she would, wouldn't she? Children, Wynne sighed. Might I get someone to hold Lelyana while I remove the arrow? Lelyana yelped as the Dalish elf's hands were suddenly on her shoulder, guiding her to lie down on the spare robes Wynne had laid out. This will hurt, dear, the healer said, but only for a moment. And that it did, as Wynne pulled the wooden shaft right out of Lelyana's knee. She could feel it scraping bone. But Mila's hands were strong, keeping her still, and someone gave her a cloth to scream into, muffling her cries. And then, the arrow was gone, and healing magic washed over her, soothing the pain. Wynne slumped, looking like she wouldn't be much more capable of walking than Lelyana was. The Dalish elf let her sit up, and Lelyana wiped the tears out of her eyes. She was about to thank the healer when she heard noise coming from one of the alley exits. The companions all stiffened, Mila's bow making a reappearance, and Finian drawing a dagger despite the crow leaning heavily against his other side. Thugs would have been bad, but this was much worse. These were armored guardsmen, a good half-dozen of them. The guards were moving cautiously, apparently having heard the noise of the fight. When they spotted the wardens, they stopped, and the two groups spent a moment staring at one another. The guards no doubt saw a group of people sitting among a circle of corpses. Lelyana could only hope it was too dark, and they were too blood-splattered, for them to recognize the faces from the wanted posters. The companions, on the other hand, saw more opponents that they were in no way equipped to fight. And so, when one of the guards suddenly cried out in alarm, the companions burst into motion. Time to go. Alistair cried, scooping up Wynne like one would a babe about to be put down for a nap. Finn and Zevran made their stumbling, four-legged way toward the end of the alley. That left Mila to take care of Lelyana. Lelyana understood, in theory, that Mila was fairly strong for an elf. She'd seen as much in their battles, most recently just now. However, the woman was not prepared for the elf to scoop her up and roll her gently onto her back, holding her thighs against either thin hip while Lelyana wrapped her arms around that delicate neck. With little more than a grunt and with no mind to her continued injuries, Mila loped off after the others, easily overtaking them as they flitted through the alleys. Never, in all her years, had Lelyana thought that she might one day receive a piggyback ride from a Dalish elf. And what a ride it was! Lelyana's knee was still sore, making her wince when Mila occasionally jarred it. However, there was nothing more exciting than the harried flit from alley to alley as they stayed just ahead of their pursuers, or the clang of armor behind them as the heavily armored guards struggled to keep pace. Mila practically flew, her gait smoother and more sure than any horse Lelyana had ever ridden, and Lelyana smiled to herself to think what the Dalish elf might think of that comparison. It wasn't long before Lelyana felt confident to hold the smaller woman tighter, because she knew she need not fear snapping the elf's delicate neck. Mila would simply refuse to let her. It was an amusing thought worth thinking about some other time. They were down in the dockside district now, passing piers and smelling fish everywhere. The moonlight bounced off the waves dazzlingly. Mila ran along one pier, but the sounds of alarm had drawn other guards, and a second squad stepped out in front of them. Mila turned their group in the only direction open toward the docks, her gait pounding on the wooden planks as they wove through a maze of mired ships. The others were tiring, even if Mila was not. Lelyana could hear Alistair's heavy breathing, and Finn seemed to be dragging Zevran more than helping him run. A glance back proved that the guards were in hot pursuit, only about 40 feet down the pier. And then, Zevran raised his head, and something he saw ahead of them made him smile. "Oi!" A call came from ahead of them, and Mila abruptly skidded to a stop, jarring Lelyana's wound. Everyone else followed suit, including the guards. The bard turned her attention forward, only to see an admittedly striking woman coming down from the huge three-masted ship they were directly in front of. The woman's dusky skin was northern, and the sway of the ample hips was that of a woman who knew the power of her own sexuality. Lelyana expected the woman to confront them, but instead, she passed the entire warden party, throwing them a wink as she did. Once she was between wardens and guardsmen, she faced down the guards with her hands on her hips. "And just what do you think you lot are doing, harassing my crew in the shadow of my own ship?" That accent was Riveni. Ah, that explained the woman's exotic coloring. "Ma'am." One of the guards stepped forward. "We found these people in the center of a slaughter. They must be taken in for questioning." "A slaughter, eh? And you just let them at it, did you? Maybe you should be bringing in whatever lowlifes attacked them then, because none of my crew would be stupid enough to start something like that. If they did, I'd slit their throats myself." This seemed to make the guardsmen uncomfortable, and Lelyana stifled a laugh. "Tell you what, it's late, I'm tired, and all you fine men could probably use a break. I'll discipline my boys here, and you lovelies can just concentrate on cleaning up whatever mess they left and take the rest of the night off. How does that sound?" They didn't seem to be buying it, the lead guard looking skeptically at the woman. Then, Finian opened his mouth. "PL please, Captain, we didn't mean nothing by it," Finian stuttered in a surprisingly awful Riveni accent. "Thays attacked us while we was comin' back from the Pearl, and John here had a bit too much to drink, and they just jumped out and we had to defend ourselves, right? Don't give me muck bucket duty again, I'd rather sit the night out in jail, I would." The woman, if anything, looked amused by this development. "You'll take your punishment and like it, sailor. You rather I docked your pay?" Finian hung his head dramatically. "No, ma'am. The guards ate up this little bit of theater." Right. Well, we'll leave it to you, then. Someone will be by in the morning to follow up for the report, though, don't you doubt it." "Right, of course." The woman waved a hand. "Off you go now, gentlemen." The guardsmen filtered away off into the night. Only after the last was gone did the woman finally turn to them. She sauntered back toward them, then stopped like she was striking a pose, her arms crossed under her ample breasts and a smirk on her lips. Well, this is certainly a nice surprise. I never thought I'd see you in Denerim, Zevran. Isabella, Zevran grinned, though the effect was somewhat lost due to the fact that he was hanging off Finian. You are looking as beautiful as ever. Beautiful and lonely. So cruel of you, Zevran, to leave me bereft of a husband and a lover in one night. At least you got the ship, from the looks of it. Isabella chuckled smokily. That I did. Come here, and perhaps I will thank you properly. Alas, I am afraid that I am now a one-elf man, Zevran sighed airily. I keep telling him that all the women of the world are left bereft without me, but he does not believe me. Because I have yet to see any legions of women pounding at our door, Finian laughed. Isabella arched a brow. So you are attempting to make this elf into an honest one? You have your work cut out for you, sweet thing. I do love a challenge. Not I give me easy and fun. Isabella looked around at the rest of them, her eyes lingering equally long on Alistair's face and Mila's torso. I was about to ask what sort of trouble you lot had gotten yourself into, but anyone who's been in a tavern in the last week could answer that. It's a good thing those pesky guards didn't get a good look at you, or that little show just now wouldn't have worked, that's for sure. She sashayed to Alistair, peering up at him appreciatively. I've never been with a Grey Warden before. I wonder if what they say about your stamina is true. That, dear Isabella, Zevran chuckled, I can confirm without doubt. Isabella hummed, and reached up to stroke Alistair's face, once. Enticing. Alistair's entire face went red. Leliana could barely contain her laughter. We thank you for helping us, Wynn cut in diplomatically. However, we are injured and must find a place to hide. So, if you are done, young lady, I fear we must be off. Oh, you need somewhere to stay? Somewhere discreet, I take it? Where no one will admit to being there to anyone of authority. Well, yes. That would be ideal. The smile on Isabella's face turned mischievous. I think I know just the place. Oh, this will be fun. 87 Crossing the Chasm. It was in the dead trenches watching the archdemon soar over its seething army of darkspawn, the army's torchlight lighting the trenches up like magma as far as the eye could see that the wardens realized just what they were up against. 7 of them against thousands. The archdemon had called together an army. And the wardens had 7. Even if most of Felicity's understanding of warfare was theoretical, she knew that these were odds not even the most reckless gambler would take. He doesn't come above the trenches much, Cardall said. Just sits down there and shrieks. Won't likely see him this far in, either. The Legion captain had pulled them into a small alcove in the old Teg ruins, offering them meager fare of water and some sort of gamey dried meat that Felicity had no wish to have identified for her. Outside their alcove, the Legion of the Dead could be heard fighting another wave off, throwing the attacking darkspawn off the great stone bridge and into the chasm below. Have you ever considered trying to take him down? Marnan said. She sat across from him with Cardall's Deep Roads map laid out on the stone table between them. The captain snorted. And how would we do that? Jump on his back? You have archers, certainly. Archdemons not our job, my lady. Whole Legion knows that. We fight the spawn, hold the line, but an archdemon? Taking one of those without a warden is suicide. That piqued Felicity's curiosity. Is that official Legion rote? The ragged tattoo-faced dwarf gave her a curious look. Close enough. Not sure where it comes from or why, but it's one of those bits of knowledge that's been passed down for a long time. I'm not willing to test it on my own men. There are few enough of us now as it is. Sodding right there are, Garrot rumbled heartily. Good man. We'll take the scaly son of a bitch. I fail to see why we do not attack it now, Sten said from somewhere in the back. Again. Khazar was the one to answer this time, giving the Cunary an incredulous look. You saw the army it had with it, right? The one that would turn us into people-shaped mush if we even got close to it? Why do you think we're trying to recruit an army, for dramatic tension? Sten gave something between a grunt and a harumph. Felicity sighed and went back to her codex. She was currently adding to her Deep Roads map, including everywhere they'd been today as well as the parts of the roads that the Legion of the Dead had mapped out. It was really fascinating how extensive it was, a dozen paths leading to nearby tags and even the surface. I still think finding Branka is madness, Cardal sighed. But if it gives us a king, I suppose it's worth the risk. We can't do anything but hold the line until there's a king to give us new orders again. Darkly, Percival added, in the meantime, Darkspawn overrun your own fortress. Yeah, something like that. You say that your current orders are to hold the line, Marnan said. What if we simply move your line? Easier said than done, I'm afraid. This bridge is just too well guarded. As soon as we try to make a move across it, they start throwing their best at us. We may be the Legion of the Dead, but I'm not going to waste useless deaths for no progress. Branka's in there, Okaran grunted. We gotta clear the bridge anyway. Cardal snorted a laugh and leaned back, shaking his head. You can most certainly try, I won't stop you. I just hope you know what you're doing. Something snapped loudly, and everyone spun to look at Garrot. The duster held up a spring mechanism and smirked. Oh yeah. We know what we're doing, don't you worry about that. Felicity took that as her cue to start packing her notes away. A pity, really, as she'd been hoping to interview Cardal a bit more. Who knew when next she'd get a chance to learn about the Legion of the Dead firsthand. Alas, they had a job to do, and a paragon to find. Felicity stood as the others did, double-checking the straps that secured her staff and her healer's kit. It still annoyed her, feeling the lightness felt by the lack of the black grimoire. How Morrigan had found out about the book, Felicity would never know, but there was no reversing the flow of knowledge. What was known was known. They emerged from the alcove to a break in the fighting. The legionnaires were lined up around the end of the bridge, weapons raised on fatigued arms, but stalwart nonetheless. Felicity wondered what sort of person it took to drop everything to fight the Darkspawn, but then she realized that it took the same sort of person that became a Grey Warden. Someone with nothing to lose. Felicity wondered whether the Grey Wardens ever recruited from the Legion of the Dead. The Wardens lined up in front of the bridge, gazing off into the distance at the ruins of Bonamar. The place was ancient, even by the standards of the Tags. The edifices of the fortress rose hundreds of feet in the air, and who could say what stood beyond those gates? All they had were a couple old maps from before the Darkspawn occupation of the fortress to go on. Marnan, Percival, Okaran, and Sten all stood at the edge of the giant stone bridge, each hefting their weapons, an impenetrable line of two-handed fighters. Or, at least Felicity hoped it would prove impenetrable, as the second line Khazar, Morrigan, and herself would prove a great deal more vulnerable. Hugo sat practically on Morrigan's feet, and Felicity wondered when the Hound had gotten so fond of Morrigan, of all people. Garrot had one final, quiet word with Cardal. Then, he started drawing things out of his scavenger's sack, pointed, nasty-looking things that Felicity really had no description for. She'd seen him use basic claw traps and the like before, particularly in their days down in the deep roads. However, none of those had seemed as complex as the broad, blade metal thing that he now very carefully placed in front of the warriors, nor the jar he put even more carefully 12 paces in front of that. Garrot lay a field of such devices along a good span of the bridge. Once his bag of tricks was exhausted, he worked his way back to the group very carefully, a smug smile on his face. Felicity had a difficult time deciding whether Garrot was ingenious, or utterly mad. It did not take long for the Darkspawn to notice their presence nearby, a side effect of their mutually tainted blood, of course. And thus, no sooner had Garrot ducked behind the front line than a rumble of footsteps could be felt through the stone of the bridge. Felicity watched, her staff at the ready, as dark figures came into view from the murk across the chasm. The first wave never reached them. It was actually a bit glorious, watching the succession of traps that the Darkspawn stumbled into. A caltrop trap led directly into a fire trap, which exploded and set off an acidic bomb. The Darkspawn went down shrieking under the resulting succession of explosions and the snapping of blade and claw traps. By the time the smoke cleared, all Darkspawn save 2 had collapsed, and those 2 crippled by caltrops and claws were as good as target practice for a laughing Khazar. Behind them, the legionnaires burst into applause. Garrot sketched a bow toward them, looking quite pleased with himself. After that little show, Felicity honestly didn't blame him. However, the traps had made a lot of noise, and that meant more Darkspawn. There were still a couple traps left unsprung, but it wasn't enough to slow the wave of foot soldiers that stumbled into their front line. The warriors sprang into motion, and the battle was joined. Felicity was casting healing spells almost immediately, healing a gash on Okaren's forearm when the dwarf dove into the fray with no regard for personal safety, and blunt damage when Percival took a mace to the armpit. Oh, she wished Percival would go back to sword and shield. He got hit much more often without his shield, and that meant more work for Felicity, whether Percival was more effective as a warrior or not. Darkspawn archers came rolling in behind this wave, staying back from the traps, but Khazar had them well enough in hand. A well-aimed fireball knocked most of them clear off the bridge and set the rest to burning. Another wave was approaching over the bridge, even as the current battle raged on. Felicity shouted, "More coming!" even as she cast a heal at Sten's sword-punctured side. A moment later, a giant spider and a Maberry tore into the fray, the former spraying webbing toward the oncoming swarm that stuck them right to the stone. The Maberry chewed his way through them. Then, one of the darkspawn got its teeth into the hound, and Felicity cast a heal at the same time that Khazar froze the monster in ice. As one, they both reached for lyrium potions. After they'd downed the potions, Khazar started casting again, but asked somewhat anxiously, "So how many of these can we take before we start getting loopy?" 3, probably. 4 at best, before side effects will make us hindrances rather than help. Felicity cast a regeneration spell on Garrot, who had somehow caught the attention of a recalcitrant Hurlock, and was trying the duck behind the berserkers to shake off its attention. Khazar nodded, his brow furrowing as he zapped a Hurlock archer with lightning. Judging by how his eyes cast down the bridge, he was doing the math. Shit. We both need to conserve, don't we? That honestly shocked Felicity. It was far more consideration than Felicity had come to expect from the once reckless elf. Yes, if the Darkspawn are as relentless as the Legionnaires say. They were making some progress, at least. Marnan and Sten seemed to remember that they were trying to push a line, and were pushing step by bloody step. Their refusal to retreat made both targets of the fresh attackers, taxing Felicity's magical reserves. Added to that was the fact that Okaren and Percy were both in full rages, and thus not concerned about their personal health at all. It was frustrating, from her healer's standpoint, to have fighters who did not appreciate just how much energy she was pouring out just to keep them all on their feet. She had her differences with Garrot, but at least the man knew how to duck. Marnan and Sten pushed forward again, and Felicity was forced to scurry down the bridge after them as they finished off the Darkspawn Morrigan had webbed and met the next wave. This group of attackers had an emissary, a fact that made itself known as the ground exploded around them. Felicity yelped, immediately throwing out heals left and right, cursing that she couldn't somehow get them all at once. Soon enough, she felt that empty pull across the fade that meant she was out of magic, and reached for the next lyrium potion. A wave of dizziness and a feeling of disconnectedness accompanied this one, but it faded quickly. The stones under her feet were shuddering, and it took her a moment to realize it wasn't the lyrium potion doing that. A moment later, she realized what was happening and spun on Khazar. No earth magic on the stone bridge. You'll send us all into the chasm. The elf stopped casting, his eyes going wide. Then, he cursed colorfully and shot a fireball at a cluster of Hurlocks instead. A pair of them growled and broke away from trying to get a shot on Sten, aiming right for Khazar instead. The young elf backed up, shooting lightning bolts at them in quick succession. They went down before getting within melee range, but Khazar had to gulp a lyrium potion afterwards. Felicity wondered what number he was on. She turned her attention back to healing. The injuries were stacking up quickly. Half of Percy's chest plate had been torn open by an alpha's greatsword, though he obviously didn't register the pain, the way he was tearing across the battlefield, and Garrot appeared to be limping. Okaren didn't seem to be using one of his hands properly, and Morrigan had dropped her spider form in favor of casting entropic spells into the crowd. Lightning burst through the wardens, and Felicity grit her teeth against the buzzing, burning pain of it. Chain lightning, of all things. Between heels, she turned a pointed look at Khazar, only to find that he was shaking off the pain too. That accursed emissary. Hugo was on it, it seemed. The dog leapt on top of the enemy spellcaster, sending both toppling to the ground with the dog's jaws at its throat. It cast a fireball in Hugo's face, sending the hound flying. Hugo. Percival could be heard crying, disengaging with his current opponent to charge the emissary. The creature was promptly cut in two. Behind him, Marnin and Sten moved the line up again, though it was getting rather too crowded to tell at this point. They were about halfway down the bridge, now. Once again, that emptiness hit her, and Felicity reached for another potion. Number 3. She downed it, and had to regain her bearings after the potion hit her stomach. She turned her attention back to the fight, but not without noting with concern the sensation of floating she was experiencing. Khazar was cursing from somewhere to her left, fire and lightning crossing the bridge with increased desperation. The warriors were flagging, the accumulation of their injuries slowing even the berserkers down. Felicity just couldn't keep up, not without getting the chance to apply some bandages and poultices and, in a couple cases, stitches. 2/3 of the way across the bridge, an ogre rumbled up, throwing a stone into the fray that sent Morrigan and Okaran both flying. Morrigan tumbled clear over the edge of the bridge, oddly eliciting a shriek and renewed bout of rage from Percival. However, she returned a moment later in her eagle form, though her flight patterns were injured and erratic. The shapeshifter landed beside Felicity, and the healer did what she could to mend the bird's broken limbs. When Morrigan returned to her human form, she nodded her thanks and shakily stood. Percival and Sten were engaging the ogre, one strong enough and the other angry enough to cause the gigantic monster pain, at the least. Marnin, meanwhile, met another wave of reinforcements with Garrot, the pair desperately trying to keep any from leaking past the line. It didn't work, as a steady stream was heading toward the mages now. Khazar and Morrigan did well enough to fend them off, the latter going so far as to bodily shove Felicity behind the two of them, but that change in tactics took their useful crowd control spells away from the warriors' front, which put more stress on them to hold the line. It was momentum, like an avalanche gaining more strength and devastation due to the steady growth of its own weight. Archer's arrows were flying now, and Felicity had to down one last potion, losing track of where she was for a moment at the wave of dizziness and confusion that accompanied it. Only Khazar's urgent cry of Felicity roused her, and she shook her head to clear it. It didn't work all that well. That was it, then. No more lyrium for her. She turned her attention back to the battle, horrified to see Percival slumped against one side of the bridge, bleeding from the head and looking dazed. The ogre fought Sten now, the Cunary gritting his teeth and matching the beast blow for blow, but the dents and slashes on his armor told of how much damage he was taking in the attempt. Marnin was down on one knee, her other leg torn up by something wicked. Flames shooting out of Khazar's hands briefly obstructed her view, but it was likely for the better, since a couple genlocks had somehow resisted Morrigan's paralysis spell and were charging the mages. Felicity scrambled to heal what she thought was the most severe head wound, leg tissue, dog's broken ribs, and then provided magical strength to Sten as the Cunary stumbled back. Another ogre could be heard stomping up the bridge, and all three mages had to duck a volley of arrows. Khazar cursed as he stood back up, his head swiveling about. "Where are those damned archers?" "I believe they are using the cover of the bridge supports," Morrigan said, pointing. "'Twould be what I would do. Time for them to meet my good friend, Mr. Fireball." The elf shot out said spell, making several archers burst from hiding, in flames. Garrot burst out of the spot as well, and Felicity cast a heal on him as he rolled to put out the flames. The other ogre crashed into Marnin's weak line, and the princess was thrown back toward the mages. Felicity cast another heal, but it was merely to keep her from dying from internal damage. Then and there she would likely not be getting up again for the rest of the fight. Morrigan shifted shape swiftly into a bear, charging up to meet the monster, and the two started wrestling. Meanwhile, Okaran was trying to tear up the legs of the first ogre, who had crushed something important enough in Sten for the Cunary to be lying face down on the stone. Felicity cast a hurried spell, repairing the damage. Oh no! That empty feeling again. Lightheaded with both dread and lyrium, she fumbled with her pack, starting to pull out potions and poultices. They would have to do. Oh maker, they were in trouble. Hugo whined in pain as lightning flew from the darkness at the edge of the bridge. Another emissary. Felicity started forward with her poultices, but a hurlock blocked her path, and she was knocked aside with a single backhand. It turned to Khazar, who met it with a blast of ice that froze it solid. Then, the elf burst it with lightning, killing it. Khazar was panting and leaning heavily on the oak branch that he used as a staff. For a moment, their eyes met, and the fear she saw in his eyes matched her own. Out of magic. Helpless. The ogre Morrigan was fighting lifted the bear clear off the ground, then turned and threw her like a boulder back the way the darkspawn had come. Felicity wanted to cry as she heard the joyous roars from the darkspawn at the other end of the bridge. Hurlocks and Genlocks swirled around the ogre and charged the mages, two of the last targets standing in their way. Once again, Khazar stepped forward, raising his staff. Bolts of nature magic fizzled weakly out of the staff, so Felicity could only wince as the first of the creatures lunged into him, slashed a clean line across his unarmored torso with his sword. Khazar stumbled back from the next flurry of strikes, red staining the front of his keeper's robes. "I'm bleeding," Khazar muttered, and for a horrible moment, it was like Ostagar all over again. Their last defense, their strongest weapon, was about to go down, and this time there was nowhere to run. And then, Khazar's head jerked up, his eyes lit with new fire. "I'm bleeding," he repeated, and this time, it sounded like a threat. Felicity leapt forward as the foot soldiers surrounded him, bringing her own weak staff to bear to defend the young man she regarded as a little brother. However, before she got there, she was blown back by a concussion of pure force, as were the darkspawn surrounding him. Felicity tumbled across the stone, rolling to a stop some 15 feet back. She looked up, sure she was going to see Khazar exploded into tiny elf bits, but what she did see made her more horrified than that. Khazar stood in a circle of pain-racked bodies, the only creature standing in a 10-foot radius. A red aura surrounded the elf, swirling dangerously and growing as it leached energy off the fallen foemen around him. But, this was, no. Khazar raised his arms, waving them in an intricate pattern that Felicity had only seen enchanters pull off. The evil aura wrapped around him, coiling tight as he charged the spell. Then, it released, and chaos broke through like demons pouring out of the Black City. A vortex of fire spun into being with wild abandon on the bridge, its monstrous column descending from the top of the chamber deep into the chasm. Wind accompanied it, gusting so strongly that Felicity had to keep her head down and grip the bridge not to be blown around like a leaf. That wind shoved a half-dozen darkspawn clear off the bridge. The fiery vortex spun down the bridge, burning and throwing around everything in its path. One of the ogres had survived the fire. It roared out its pain and charged Khazar, but the mage stepped forward to meet the monster, raising a hand and emitting a blast of force that stopped the gigantic beast in its tracks. It stumbled back, and Khazar raised his hands again, his gesturing painting streaks through the red aura. The ogre roared again, this time in agony, and its blood exploded in its veins. The monster twitched for some time even after it had died. Khazar stepped past their allies. Those who were conscious looked as horrified as Felicity was and directed a stream of lightning that soared straight across the huge cavern to the fortress gates. Distant shrieks could be heard. Shakily, Felicity got to her feet and followed in the elf's destructive wake. Marnan was trying to sit up nearby, pale and staring after the elf. "Was that not?" she wheezed. Felicity only nodded and gave her a potion. Next was Percy, still slumped by the side of the bridge. He, too, watched Khazar's progress. Though dazed, his eyes were hard and cold. She gave him a poultice for his head. The others got similar care as she went to each one by one with first aid supplies. Neither Garrot, nor Okaren, could be awakened, and Felicity thought Morrigan must be somewhere farther down the bridge. The rest, however, were silent as they picked themselves up and started collecting what they could salvage. Felicity hurried up the bridge, terrified by Khazar's destructive power with every charred and mutilated corpse she came across. It appeared the elf had done that explosive blood thing several more times, including on an emissary. It made her want to vomit, to know what sort of magic allowed him to do something like that. Finally, she found Morrigan. The witch had reverted to her human form, and was lying unconscious but alive among a circle of savaged corpses. Careful of Morrigan's obvious blunt trauma injuries from being thrown so far, Felicity knelt down. She could feel her magic trickling back now, so she used what little she had left to reach into Morrigan and fix just enough of the damage to keep the woman going. It would take days for this sort of injury to heal, even with magic. Exhausted in every way, Felicity jumped when she heard the scuffle of footsteps. She snapped her gaze upwards and saw Khazar coming back up the bridge. That aura was still swirling around him, and the expression on his face was eerie in its blankness. Khazar stopped when he saw Felicity watching him, the two 20 feet away from one another. From across a newly opened divide, they studied one another. Felicity couldn't say what the boy was looking for, but she herself was disturbed by his expression. She would have expected something. Anything. Anger. Violent glee. Power satiation. Nothing. They're dead, he croaked emptily. The aura around him faded, and he was suddenly very pale. You killed them all, Felicity agreed. With blood magic. You're a blood mage. Yeah. He swayed. I'm a blood mage. Khazar collapsed, and Felicity burst into silent tears. 88 The other side of blood magic. Mouse was waiting for him. Amazing, the demon's voice rumbled in his ear. Purred, almost. You are magnificent. They'll never understand, he whispered back into the darkness. I had to do it. They were all dying. Then that is their failing, not yours. A hand ran through his hair, comforting. He wanted to shake it off, but he was just so tired. He was tired of fighting, and tired of making excuses to everyone. He was tired of hiding the horrible deal he'd made. Not horrible, a bit overeager perhaps, learning the arts from desire. There was amused contempt in the demon's low voice. You needn't have dealt with that creature at all, I was more than willing to teach it all to you for free. It wrapped around him, like a stifling blanket, and he knew he should keep fighting it. But he could barely open his eyes even in the fade, so what was the point? Something took him in large arms and rocked him, and it was as comforting as anything would get, especially now that they knew. Did he have to keep his guard up, even here? No. Damn it, the demon wasn't getting him like this. Khazar forced his tired mental projection into wakefulness, shoving out of the demon's arms. He landed on the ground, weak, bruised, and sore in a way he'd never been before. Like he'd just overexerted a brand new muscle. He opened his eyes to the fade, forcing himself to pick himself up despite all weakness. Mouse sat before him now in human form, watching him do it with a knowing smile. What? Khazar snapped, in no mood to deal with this creature when things were going so poorly in the real world. Maker, they knew. You need not be so guarded against me, mage. You know I won't make a move until you will it so. Come, you need something to wind you down. Perhaps some sweets. Mouse snapped his fingers, and a pair of dream mice scurried into view, carrying a platter on their backs. Mouse removed the lid to reveal Orleans cocoa-filled pastries. Those had always been Khazar's favorite treats. On those rare occasions the apprentices were given them at the Circle Tower. A poor substitute, I admit, when you have access to the real thing, Mouse sighed. But perhaps even the fade mimicry will help settle your nerves about the battles before you. Khazar's mouth watered just looking at the assortment, but he remained stubbornly standing. You've been in my memories. You're already in my head, aren't you? I admit, I've peaked. I couldn't help myself. Mouse flashed him an unapologetic smile and helped himself to one of the pastries. You are such a fascinating creature, mage, obviously born to be great, but constantly tied down by those pathetic nothings that you consider friends. They won't be friends anymore. Not now that they know what I am. Khazar slumped to the ground. Mouse offered him a pastry in condolence. Against his better judgment, the elf took it. And that is their failing, not yours, Mouse repeated, taking a bite of his own confection. What you said before is true, they'd all have died without your blood magic. And look how much it turned the battle. If you truly must think my kind's gifts are sacrifice, at least it is one that has proven well worth it. Khazar swallowed, because the demon made sense. As little as he wanted to admit it, the demon's words were hitting a note of truth deep inside him. Only because I am right. Mouse sat back with a smirk. The fact is that your mortal companions are unable to comprehend just how much potential you have. I, on the other hand, have seen your core, and I know just what you may be capable of, given the correct tools. I will give you those tools, when you let me in. Consider, mage, being capable of taking out that entire army in that trench, single-handed, No lyrium potions necessary. Imagine blasting the archdemon to pieces without ever having to draw it to the ground. Khazar took a careful nibble of the pastry in his hand. It was an imitation of the real-world confection, but it tasted good all the same. You would help me fight against Darkspawn. Mouse laughed, and his voice briefly had the low rumble of his true form. Why, I most certainly would. If we were sharing your world, you and I would do everything in my power to ensure there was as much of it possible for me to enjoy. That most certainly involves stopping your blight by any means necessary. He paused to take a bite of his pastry. It would be poetic, don't you think? Darkspawn are creatures of our world, released in yours. Let them be destroyed by a similar being of both worlds, you and mage. Khazar shook his head. I'm not becoming an abomination. I refuse to be. Abomination is such a pithy term. It is what weaklings who cannot handle the power turn into. It is the word for that Connor creature, those who fumble with the arts with no direction or true understanding of what power really is. You and I would be no abomination, mage. We would be a god. Khazar shivered, enticed by the demon's words despite himself. More, they had been bound for a while now, long enough for Khazar to be able to sense that Mouse believed every word he was saying. There was no deception here. Pride did not need to deceive, not in something like this. Mouse reached over, running a hand soothingly down his face. Khazar flinched, but did not slap it away. You need not make your decision yet, mage. I have waited long, and I can wait longer still for a host as magnificent as you. Just know that I will be here, only a thought away, should you call. Something was pulled at him, drawing him out of the fade. He was waking up. As the fade shimmered out around him, Khazar watched Mouse finish the last of his pastry. Be strong, mage, the demon's voice rumbled in his ear as it all disappeared. And remember that you were right. Blackness surrounded him, and he could feel himself being tugged toward the waking world like surfacing from a dive. The waters were cold, but he felt a lingering presence somewhere nearby that had not been there before, at least, not so overtly. He should have been terrified and he was, but he also found comfort in it, and wasn't that all kinds of wrong? He took his first breath of consciousness, and immediately regretted it. He ached everywhere, and he was too weak to even draw breath to complain. Horrible thirst parched his tongue, and he was cold everywhere, with hardly the strength to shiver. Be a couple more hours before she awakens, someone was saying nearby. She took a good bit of damage when that ogre threw her. She was lucky to still be in bear form at the time, or she would likely have not survived the impact. Maker, was it really that close? Said another. Percival, Khazar realized. And the first voice was, of course, Felicity. If I didn't know better, Garot's low voice rumbled through a cough. I'd say the little firecracker saved all our asses with his stunt. His stunt, Garot, Felicity snapped, was blood magic. Oh, my mistake. His blood magic saved all our asses, then. Being saved by demons is not any respite at all, Percival said gravely. They will call in their debts, sooner or later. How poorly these people understand mine, an amused voice rumbled in the back of Khazar's head. Khazar squeaked in surprise at hearing Mouse speak in the waking world. Mouse really was inside him already. By the fade, did that mean he was already an abomination, and hadn't realized it? Mouse chuckled at the thought. No, mage. We are not yet one. Not until you choose to make it so. I will not join with you unless it's your choice. Of that, you have my word. It shouldn't have been comforting, but strangely, it was. Elf? You awake, elf? Garot's voice rumbled nearby, pulling his attention back outside. With some difficulty, Khazar forced his eyes open. He was on a bedroll somewhere in the ruins of Bonamar, judging by the stonework on the walls. A couple pallets were scattered across the cramped little room, on which lay Morrigan, Marnan, and Sten. Felicity and Percival knelt next to the witch's bedroll, but Garot was now leaning over Khazar. Khazar spent a moment staring up at the dwarf, trying to get the room to focus properly. The dwarf smirked and reached down to tweak his nose. He yelped. I'm awake. He was alarmed by the dry crack in his voice. I'm awake, he repeated, a bit more strongly. How you feeling, elf? Weak. Really thirsty? Do you have any water? Garrot glanced back at the others pointedly. Felicity made no move toward him, merely staring at him as if he had just turned into an abomination and bitten the head off a baby. No help there, then. Not that he was surprised. Garrot sighed and stood to grab a bucket and ladle from the corner. The dwarf was moving carefully around an injury on his chest, Khazar noted, just as Percival had bandages wrapped around his head. All of them were sporting something, it seemed, except the healer. Garrot returned to his bedside and brought a ladle of lukewarm water to his lips. He nearly laughed with relief as the liquid slid down his throat, and he greedily took each spoonful the other warden offered. When he drank his fill, he laid back with a sigh and closed his eyes. You lost a lot of blood, Felicity's voice said nearby. That's why you're feeling so awful. Trying to make me feel guilty. He snapped. Don't you? She returned. He turned his head to look at her, seeing her wearing her lecture face. Blood magic is evil, Khazar. You know that, the keeper you had to kill was a blood mage, right? So were the mages who destroyed the tower, and the disaster at Red Cliff started with blood magic. And every unjust slaughter in history involved swords and arrows, but you don't see them outlawed. That's completely different. Why? Because the Chantry says so. Khazar shoved himself into a sitting position, despite the weakness and dizziness that washed over him. Magic is a tool, Felicity, one that can be used for better or worse, and blood magic is no exception to that. Except the fact that it makes you more amenable to demons, Felicity shot back. The others, Percival, Garrot, and Marnan, watched their exchange in silence. How long have you been dealing with demons, Khazar? My entire life. I'm a mage, we deal with demons our entire lives, if only to fight them off. For all the Chantry warnings against blood magic, I've found it no more dangerous than the damned harrowing, which they make us undertake. His shouting drew outside attention in the form of Okaren bursting into the chamber, waving his axe and stumbling a bit. Where's sitting danger? Percival gave him a flat look. Aren't you out of booze by now? Heh, you wish. Okaren stumbled back, half against a wall. It distracted most of them from Khazar's magical choices, except for fucking Felicity. She still stared at him like a mother disappointed in her recalcitrant child. It was too much, he couldn't breathe. Khazar shoved himself to his feet, stumbling a bit when the strength leached out of him. He stubbornly kept his feet, though the worried look Garrot gave him indicated he'd gone white. Khazar. Felicity protested. Eat deep stalker shit, Khazar spat back, storming out of the chamber as best he was able in his condition. He wove through a series of tunnels and came out onto the platform overlooking the chasm. He sat on the edge of the chasm, sighing in relief, because his legs had been about to give, peering down at the river of magma below. Nearby, Khazar could see the bridge swarming with legionnaires, rather than dark spawn. One of several good things that the evil of blood magic had wrought. They cannot understand, Mouse's voice whispered. Their minds are closed. But you, mage, know how wonderful blood magic can be. Look at the win you wrought today, all because you used what we gave you. Khazar nodded, his indignation fading before the demon's soothing words. Perhaps their source was demonic, but the words themselves could not have been more true. He'd turned a tide today, and damn whether that win wannabe approved or not. Something scuffed behind him, and he turned in time to see Garrot settling down on the ledge beside him. Garrot held out a flask. Okaren's finest, one a sip. Khazar hesitated, then took the offered flask. It burned going down, and he coughed. Stealing from our party members, now. He wheezed, handing the flask back. Garrot smirked. Figured the old man had had enough. Khazar managed a weak chuckle. You okay, kid? Khazar shook his head, wiping his mouth. It's fine. You know what you're doing. I think so. Garrot arched a brow and took a swig. Don't sound too sure, kiddo. Khazar gazed into the chasm. How easy it would be to throw oneself into it, were one inclined. Khazar had never been inclined toward anything like that, preferring to scratch and claw at obstacles until he got his way instead. I didn't mean to become a blood mage. It just happened. By the fade, he was beginning to sound like Jowan. But now that I am one, I'm going to use what I've got against them. He waved toward the ruins where the darkspawn still ran rampant. We need every weapon, even the ones that others may not approve of. That's what it means to be a Grey Warden during a blight. Yep. Startled, Khazar did a double take. You're not going to argue with me? Garrod shrugged. Why? I agree with ya, kid. If you got the weapon, and know how to wield it without hurting yourself, I say use it. This is an ally worthy of you, Mouse whispered. Despite himself, Khazar smiled, agreeing. Thank you, he said, a little thickly. Anytime, kid. Anytime. 89 wherein disregard for privacy pays off. Given their new status as fugitives, it took them a week to finally get the chance to speak with Brother Genitivi. Usually, Wynne might not have complained about the break. Leliana's knee certainly needed the rest except for the place where they were staying in the meantime. The Pearl. What sort of madness had taken the wardens, that they thought a brothel was a proper place for them to stay? Sure, it was certainly discreet enough for a hiding place. The Pearl seemed to operate in a world outside any earthly laws, but the people inside, who were helping them? Wynne was torn between wanting to frog march the wardens out of the building immediately and wishing she were still young enough to enjoy some of the entertainments. Isabella proved a useful connection, getting them into a room in the back of the Pearl without any questions. Finian and Leliana had taken turns singing for their supper, and had disappointed quite a few patrons over the week as the customers learned that neither was for rent. Leliana was disturbingly good at putting on a show for the patrons. It made Wynne wonder just how bardic the girl was. Then, 5 days in, a chubby man named Slim ducked into the tavern, waited for Finian to finish his set, and drew him into a back room to talk. When Finn came back, he was grinning broadly, and the wardens got to planning how to get back up to the market district without drawing unwanted attention. They settled on calling on another contact of Finian's, a guard captain of all things, to divert patrols from their route. This allowed the wardens to walk right up to the scholar's doorstep and go inside. When they were met with only the man's assistant, it seemed it was an operation wasted. However, while Finian and Wynne drilled the twitchy man on information regarding the scholar's whereabouts, Zevran was snooping around in the background. Suddenly, Waylon, the assistant, broke off his guesses of checking near Lake Calenhood to spin on Zevran. You can't go back there, he snapped. The crow, who had been curiously eyeing a doorway deeper into the house, arched a brow. Why not? Finian asked. Why not, why? It's private, that's why. Even Alistair seemed surprised. We did explain who we were, right? How we're wardens looking to stop the end of life as we know it. What if there's something back there that might lead us to Genitivi? There's not. It's just his study, and I would prefer it not be disturbed until he gets back. The man turned back toward them, only to yelp as he found Mila knocking an arrow so close to his face that it was practically touching his nose. The Dalish elf's expression was hard. Finian, however, looked serene. Let's try this again. What's back there, Waylon? Oh my. Leliana and Zevran had taken advantage of the man's distraction to duck inside and see. Leliana covered her mouth with her hands in the doorway, and Zevran disappeared into the room with a frown. Waylon's eyes darkened. I gave you a chance to turn back. I hate to alarm anyone, Zevran's voice called. But I do not believe that is Waylon. A fireball burst forth inside the tiny shack, proving their point. Wynne scrambled to her feet, activating a healing aura that would soothe most of the burns. Then, she went about snuffing what she could of the fires that started around the wooden building. Nearby, she felt the magical pressure of Templar magic, and sighed in relief as the enemy mage cried out, drained. An arrow and a slash of Alistair's sword later, the impostor lay dead at their feet. Zevran emerged from the back room, paging through a journal with a raised brow. Leliana, meanwhile, could be heard chanting funeral rites for someone in the back room. It was not difficult to deduce what had happened from that. So, who was this guy, exactly? Alistair asked, cleaning the blood off his sword. Finian knelt beside the body to study him. An assassin, maybe? Meant to trap us and anyone looking for the ashes. A very poor assassin, If that is so, Zevran said distractedly. At Finn's curious look, he shrugged. What? His manner was all wrong. Not very professional at all. About as professional, Alistair pointed out drily, as hiring a blood mage apostate to kill your only political rival. Good point. And to think, I thought Loghain had good taste, thus why he hired me. He held out the journal. Or perhaps this mage was from someplace else. There may be another faction that does not wish Genitivy to be found. They crowded around the journal that the assassin held, when spotting the relevant information first. Haven? I've never heard of such a place. The journal says it's rumored to be somewhere in the Frostback Mountains. Oh goody, Alistair sighed. Let's go find some mountain climbing gear. I think I'm going to need warmer socks. When can you dash? Oh, for pity's sake, Alistair. Were you never taught to darn your own socks in the chantry? Alistair made a sound not unlike a child denied a sweet. She sighed and relented. The boy did, admittedly, have very good puppy eyes. Very well. But so help me, Alistair, while we are traveling, I am teaching you to sew. 90 Battle Hymn of the Champion. First day, they come and catch everyone. Marnan stopped at the sound of a distant voice, its echo bouncing eerily up the tunnel. She motioned the others to a halt and listened. Second day, they beat us and eat some for meat. What is that? Percival asked beside her. I don't know. Marnan swallowed and started forward through the bowels of the darkspawn nest once again. The steps of her comrades behind her were more cautious. Third day, the men are all gnawed on again. The tunnel twisted ahead of them, narrowing so that they had to pass through one at a time. The walls wept with viscous flesh-colored goo. Fourth day, we wait in fear for our fate. The voice was up ahead, getting louder as they stepped closer. Hugo growled as something fell wetly from the ceiling of the tunnel, but there was no movement beyond that, and they passed on. Fifth day, they return and it's another girl's turn. She sounds unseated, Percival murmured. Marnan shuddered and nodded, trying not to listen to the words, because something told her this rhyme was no idle poem. Sixth day, her screams we hear in our dreams. The tunnel opened up into ancient dwarven masonry, but it had fallen to the taint long ago. Awful fleshy growths clung to the walls and corners, weeping with the same goo she had noted before. The smell was abhorrent. Seventh day, she grew as in her mouth they spew. Behind her, someone retched. Garrot forced a chuckle. You'd think a blood mage would have a stronger stomach than that, elf. Shut up. This is disgusting. Eighth day, we hate it as she is violated. Marnan was shaking now, but nonetheless wound her way through the maze of fleshy masses that had overtaken the ruined Tag. They had to press on. Ninth day, she grins and devours her kin. Cannibalism, Felicity breathed. That must be how they induce it. She sounded horrified by something. Marnan did not want to know what. Now she does feast, as she's become the beast. Now, only an old door separated them from the speaker. Marnan checked behind her, to make sure the others were ready. They were silent and pale, but they were prepared for a fight. However, when she opened it, there was no fight to be had. All that met them was an increase in the unholy stench and the beginning of the poem again. First day, they come and catch everyone, chanted a voice in the corner of the large chamber. A dwarf huddled there, hunched over, and staring blankly at a wall. Second day, they beat us and eat some for meat. Marnan recoiled as she got closer. No, not a dwarf. A ghoul. The taint was strong in her, eyes murky and black splotches taking over her skin. Third day, the men are all gnawed on again. The ghoul scratched her arm compulsively, seemingly unaware of their approach. Fourth day, we wait in fear for our fate. Wait, Okaran breathed. I know her. Hespeth. Fifth day, they return and it's another girl's turn. No response. Hespeth. Sod it, woman, where's Branka? Sixth day, her screams we hear in our dreams. The wardens gathered around the woman. Seventh day, she grew as in her mouth they spew. Felicity dared to venture closer to her, peering at the woman, Hespeth. This behavior is compulsive. It seems that the taint has driven her mad. 8th day, we hate it as she is violated. This ain't no taint, woman. Okaren growled. 9th day, she grins and devours her kin. It's not taint that did this, Percival whispered, looking pale. This is something completely different. Now she does feast, as she's become the beast. Okaren let out a cry of frustration, stalking up to the woman and slapping her across the face. The ghoul twitched, broken out of her reverie, and Marnan reached a hand back to her axe, just in case. However, this ghoul was no more mindless than Ruck had been. Her taint-blinded eyes turning to stare at them, then shifted to focus on something on the far floor. What's this? Humans? Bland and unlikely. Feeding time brings only kin and clan. Her voice softened. I am cruel to myself. You are a dream of strangers' faces and open doors. Hespeth. Come on, girl. I don't understand, Felicity said, continuing to peer at the woman. This does not act like typical corruption. Corruption? The woman cried, spinning toward Felicity. The mage stumbled back under her regard. The men did that. Their wounds festered and their minds left. They are like dogs, marched ahead, the first to die. The woman slumped, and the wardens listened in dawning horror as she went on. Not us. Not me. Not Laren. We are not cut, we are fed. Friends in flesh and blood and bile and. Stop. Khazar shuddered. Just stop. She did not stop. All I could do was wish Laren went first. I wished it upon her so that I would be spared. But I had to watch. I had to see the change. How do you endure that? How did Branka endure? What change? Felicity breathed. More important, Branka was here. Okaren cut in, like a dog worrying a bone. Where is she? Is she all right? Branka. Hespeth hissed. Do not speak to me of Branka. Her lover, and I could not turn her. Wait, what? Okaren sputtered. Forgive her, but no, she cannot be forgiven. Not for what she did. Not for what she has become. The other wardens looked too shaken to go on, so Marnan stepped forward, waving the warrior away. Bile rose in her throat, but she swallowed it and placed herself in front of the creature, trying her best to appear non-threatening. What did she do, Hespeth? What did she become? I will not speak of her. Of what she did, of what we have become. She got increasingly agitated, her voice losing the monotone of the chant. I will not turn. I will not become what I have seen. Not Laren. Not Branka. The woman burst into motion with such suddenness that Marnan stumbled back, fearing an attack. However, Hespeth did not attack. She fled, tearing out of the room, deeper into the acrid tunnels. Hugo started after her, but Percy called him back. We should let her go, Percival said solemnly. She has suffered enough. Marnan nodded numbly, trying to process what little of the broken story Hespeth had spoken of. The others looked similarly shaken. Sten's expression was grim, Okaren and Garrot both appeared to be shocked into silence, and Morrigan looked vaguely ill. Khazar was muttering to himself, eyes wide and distant, and Felicity had gone pale as a ghost, also whispering something under her breath. Not really wanting to, she turned to Felicity. What does it mean? Felicity took a moment to look down at her, and she had to wet her lips a couple times. For a long time, scholars have wondered how Darkspawn turn people into their own kind. I think this dwarf has just told us. No, Garrot's voice whispered. It fills many gaps, Felicity went on. Why do Darkspawn drag their prey away? How are they able to replenish themselves so quickly? Where do the different species of Darkspawn come from? The more sense it makes, the more I wish I didn't know. Damn it, Felicity, Marnan said. Speak plainly. Felicity shook her head, struggling for a moment. The men, they turn into ghouls. Like Ruck, and the unlucky ones will devolve into mindless monsters. There has never been a full female ghoul spotted, not even during blights. Did you know that? No, females, if what Hespeth said is true, females corrupted with the taint are taken underground, and cared for, and fed. They are systematically corrupted further through bodily fluids and cannibalism too. She cut herself off with a squeak. To become one of them, Garrot finished quietly. Felicity nodded and buried her face in her hands. Stone. Okaren groaned. Branka, what have you done? Marnan shuddered, that awful poem once again running through her head. It was a tale of awful things, torture, and rape, and cannibalism, so much suffering that simply seeing it had driven a woman mad. In what state must this Laren be? She took a deep breath and looked back up, because they needed to continue on. She froze, though, as she saw Garrot watching her with wide eyes. That could have been you, he whispered, and Marnan felt ill all over again. He was right. If it hadn't been for the wardens, the darkspawn would have eventually overwhelmed her. Your own father banished you out here, the other dwarf continued. You might have been a monster like that, because of him. He did not know. Does that matter? Marnan looked long and hard into the duster's eyes, realizing with flagging heart that, no, it did not. Not with something this horrific. She looked away, her sense of conviction flagging at the terrible thought. Women should not be allowed in the deep roads, she realized. Not in the patrols, not in the army, not even in the Legion of the Dead. The risk was simply too high. This. Percival said softly into the tense silence, this is why we fight Darkspawn. This is why we are Grey Wardens. Marnan raised her head, watching the human pace through the chamber, his hound at his heels as he spoke. Because, no matter how horrific our own crimes be, they thuggery, theft, murder, apostasy, or even blood magic, none of those can hold a candle to the pure, unmitigated evil that is Darkspawn. His voice gave strength to Marnan's flagging courage. These are creatures that corrupt everything, and we must do everything in our power to stop this blight before it gains a foothold. Think of all the women who might one day know the fate of these down here. We fight for them. Think of all the children who might never know what it means to live on untainted soil. We fight for them. Think of all the lives in Thedas, many of whom don't even know there's a blight begun. They need us to press on, that is our duty as Grey Wardens. This got a couple grunts of agreement from the regrouping party. Marnan smiled, glad for the man's help in rallying the others when she could not. In war, victory. Percival said, raising his sword. Marnan and Felicity spoke the next part with him, in peace, vigilance. And then, all together quietly they finished, in death, sacrifice. Percival nodded and turned, and the party fell into step behind him with renewed vigor. They trotted through the hallways of the old Tag, no longer seeing the corruption as merely spreading growths but rather as indications of the evil that they had to stop. That they could stop. Thank you, Marnan said, falling into step beside the nobleman. We needed that. To her surprise, the man gave her a tight smile. You did deputize me, if I recall correctly. And it is reassuring to see that my choice in lieutenants was no folly. Percival shrugged a bit. Hugo, walking at the man's other side, turned his head and whined anxiously as they passed a side corridor. What's wrong, boy? 'Tis the creature, Morrigan said, peering into the darkness. She is following us. Marnan shuddered again, wondering what Hespeth was doing. She did not think the woman was in any way malevolent, but the reminder of what they had done to her did not help. The distraction did not last long as they stepped out into a wide-open cavern and were greeted by a charging ogre. Marnan threw herself gladly into the next series of battles, thinking little as they tore through the old Tag. Hespeth's whispers followed them through the cavernous halls, the woman seemingly unable to contain her story, now that she had begun to tell it. They took Laren, Hespeth's voice warbled behind them as they stepped through a heavy double door. They made her eat the others, our friends. She tore off her husband's face and drank his blood. They entered a hewn tunnel, where there was an ominous rumbling up ahead. Hugo seemed agitated by whatever it was, his ears back flat against his head. They all had their weapons out, so none of them had a hand free to pet the animal. And while she ate, Hespeth said, she grew. She swelled and turned grey and she smelled like them. They remade her in their image. Then, she made more of them. The fleshy growths were everywhere, floor, ceiling, walls. Marnin's boots sunk into them as they turned a corner and beheld the monster that had once been a dwarven woman named Laren. Brood Mother. There was no dwarf left in this monstrous creature. She was a pile of flesh, mound upon mound of corrupted fat and skin, piled higher than most houses. Tentacles squirmed around her gelatinous form, some waving in the air while others wound into the dirt. Her eyes, though, her eyes were those of a dwarven woman, maddened and corrupted by taint, but proof that all that Hespeth had said was true. Marnin froze, the fact crashing down upon her that, in another reality, this might have been her. Without Duncan and the wardens, yes, even Braska, she would have been dragged back here. She would have been fed corruption until she bulged and deformed. She would have happily eaten the flesh of her one-time companions and comrades. She would be creating more of these creatures, continuing the deadly cycle. It could not be allowed to stand. Marnin hefted her axe, staring down the monster as it roared. Genlocks appeared out of the darkness to guard their brood mother, and roared in echo. Marnin had her own roar in return. Farlaren! She cried, surprising herself, but the others took up the cry. A fireball shot into the brood mother and her kind, and Hugo streaked after with a resounding bark. Marnin was at the dog's heels. The first swing of her axe bit into one of the tentacles blocking the brood mother. The monster shrieked, and Okaren dove in ahead of her to sink his own axe into her meaty flesh. Sten, who had a warhammer at this point, knocked the genlocks aside like toys. Percival was stuck at the side of the cavern, fighting a tentacle that had sprung up from the ground under him. His great sword hewed at it, but even his two-handed sword had difficulty cutting through it. Morrigan, meanwhile, was blocking the entrance from back up with webbing in her spider form. Lightning zapped through the brood mother, and she thrashed. Marnin was knocked away with one giant tentacle, Okaren sent flying the other direction. Garrot, a moment later, climbed up its back, smashing his hand axe into the creature's neck. One of its tentacles shot up and grabbed Garrot by the ankle and started swinging him around. Marnin leapt in and planted herself at the base of the tentacle, then began chopping at it like a woodcutter looking to fell a tree. And fall it did. 3 hard swings cut the tentacle off at the base, and Garrot landed in a pile of limp appendage with an oof, dizzy but unharmed. The same couldn't be said about Okaren, who was the next to be grabbed. He was thrown against the wall. Fortunately, Felicity was fast with her heels. The chamber was filling up, however, as more darkspawn tunneled in. A hurlock appeared from practically below where Marnin and Garrot were trying to untangle the ladder from the hewn tentacle. It burst up between them with a roar, and Marnin smashed her axe forward in reaction. Garrot's dagger pierced its back at the same time, and the monster went down without doing more than scratching Marnin's armor. There were more, though. Sten was buried in the things, despite how Hugo tore through the monsters and Khazar shot at clusters with wild abandon. Felicity was surrounded, Morrigan's entropic spells standing between her and death. Marnin entertained the idea of helping with the smaller darkspawn, but the brood mother had other ideas. Something thick wrapped around her waist, and Marnin was lifted clear off the ground. The monster brought the dwarf close to its face and roared, and Marnin fought not to gag at its rancid breath. She brought her axe down and around on the monster's exposed chest, cutting a weeping black line across the monster's right breast. It roared again, tainted spittle splattering across her, and Marnin brought her axe around to swipe at that monstrously deformed face. It jerked her back, and her axe swiped by harmlessly. The grip of the tentacle around her tightened, and she felt her armor buckle under the pressure. Marnin grit her teeth against the pain as deforming metal met her ribcage. A burst of healing from somewhere below her eased it, but there may be a slight breathing problem now. The ground rumbled under the brood mother, and the monster sank into a lopsided sinkhole with a shriek and loosened her grip. This distracted it enough for Marnin to wiggle through, and she looked back at her companions in time to see Khazar gesture, clamping a maw of stone over the tentacle that had been holding her. The elf smiled thinly as he noticed her regard, then turned to encase a charging pair of genlocks in ice. Marnin was in front of the broodmother's distended stomach, so she rose up and took a swing, rupturing it open. What spilled out was a nightmare of blackened innards and corrupted goo. It coated her boots, making footing slick. The monster roared, and Marnin found herself borne up once again, this time by a grip on her thigh that had her dangling upside down. Her vision spun as the brood mother shook her around. In the midst of the dizzying spinning, Marnan caught a glimpse of someone up, down, on the ledge above the group. Even upside down, she recognized the paragon who had once been the star of Orzammer. Uncorrupted and watching their battle coolly. Branka! Marnan shouted, pointing with her axe. The brood mother shook her again, and Marnan lost sight of the woman. By the time Marnan swung her axe up and cut her leg free, making her topple onto the brood mother's shoulder, the paragon had disappeared from her previous perch. It was enough for Okaran, though. The warrior, who had been raging in a circle of dark spawn, suddenly roared out, "Branka!" and disappeared through a crevice off to the side of the chamber where the woman had just been. The dark spawn he had been fighting followed him out, as did a good half-dozen after that. "Okaran, wait!" Felicity yelled, but he was long gone. Percival cursed and dove into the crevice after him, Hugo at his heels. Morrigan gulped down a lyrium potion and shouted, "I have poultices, I will keep them alive." Then, she turned into a wolf and surged out after them. "Good luck!" Felicity shouted back, healing Marnan even as the dwarf felt something acidic burn through her side. Marnan swung down, cleaving her axe into the broodmother's left arm from her precarious perch on the thing's thrashing shoulder. Garrot, meanwhile, hacked at the monster's other side, apparently trying to climb it but unable to get a good foothold through all the pus and blood. Sten defended the mages, letting Felicity concentrate on keeping the pair of them alive. Easier said than done. The broodmother's fluids burned, and she had a tentacle wrapped around one of Marnan's ankles yet again. Marnan clung to her axe, still lodged in the thing's collarbone, so the tentacles tugging proved fruitless. A volley arrows pounded against the wall nearby as a line of genlocks took advantage of her being stretched out before them. Marnan grit her teeth over a scream as she felt two of the things piercing through her rent armor and diving deep in her back. So deep she could feel the metal arrowheads scraping things that were not meant to ever meet metal. She didn't have time to assess the damage, however, as the brood mother got another tentacle onto her leg and gripped it above the first. With a twist and a yank, Marnan's right leg broke in half with a pop and a snap. This time, she did scream, but stubbornly gripped her axe for dear life. Stone, she could feel her knee tearing away from her leg muscles. "Elf!" Garrot's voice called wildly, and it took Marnan a moment to realize through the pain he was being wrapped up and constricted by a tentacle. "We could use some fireworks, here." "I can't. I'll hit you." Khazar's voice shouted back. "Do it!" Marnan shouted, trusting her dwarven magic resistance to keep her alive. She ignored what tasted like blood in the back of her throat. It seemed to take forever before the air heated around her. The rancid cavern air started swirling, and the acrid stench of burning flesh became stifling. The brood mother threw back its head and shrieked, and the grips around Marnan's leg loosened. She grit her teeth against the pain, between her shattered leg and the arrows. She doubted even Felicity could do anything for it now, and instead steadied herself as best she could on the monster's tossing shoulder. She planted her good leg deep into the flesh of the monster's breast, and wriggled her axe free of its collarbone. The heat was stifling, fire blocking her view of anything but the brood mother, but the force of the vortex also kept her shoved up into the thing's side. Her leg was mangled, there were arrowheads inside her, and the monster's acidic juices coated her. She could take a couple burns on top. With a roar of her own, Marnan yanked her axe out and swung it around, the blade sinking satisfyingly into the monster's throat. It gurgled and spat, and she did it again, and again. She didn't stop swinging until its head flew free, and the body slumped down in a mass of charred, oozing flesh. She bounced as the body collapsed into itself, taking her with it. Garrot reached in and yanked her free before she could be buried in rolls of fat and blood. The pair of them rolled across the chamber, coming to a stop in the middle of the room. And only then, the threat of the brood mother nullified, did Marnan feel it. Pain. Weakness. A metallic taste in her mouth that, upon rolling on her side and spitting, did indeed appear to be blood. Marnan gingerly reached back to touch the arrow shafts, trying to guess what they'd hit. Something important, judging by the waviness of her vision. Even brushing the shafts shot pain through her. Marnan had been on the battlefield enough to recognize a mortal wound when she felt one. For a moment, tight fear flashed through her, then despair. No. She shoved it aside. No. She wouldn't linger on that. She could hear her companions cleaning up the last of the darkspawn in the chamber, and there would be more ahead. She couldn't break down, they needed her to be strong. The last of the broodmother's guards went down, and wardens had a brief respite, but roars echoed from the tunnel that Okaren and the others had disappeared down. Marnan could feel the mass of them ahead, now agitated by the death of their broodmother. Her warden senses were smothered in it. Percy, Okaren, and Morrigan had no hope of fending off that many enraged darkspawn alone. Khazar, pale and panting, let his blood mage aura drop. He reached down and pulled Felicity to her feet. The healer had a gash down her back that couldn't have helped her spell cast any. Sten, standing over them both, eyed the path that had led them into the chamber. More are coming. Let's not be here when they get here, Garrote said, pushing up to his feet. He turned to help Marnan up, then went stone still as he really looked at her. She didn't want to know what he saw. Marnan! Felicity cried in alarm, going pale. She raised her staff to cast. Don't! Marnan grit out, rolling over and managing to get a knee under her. She stayed steady through a wave of vertigo. Even speaking was making her dizzy. Keep going. Just keep going until you can't. Don't waste your magic. I can feel the damage. Any healing you do won't last through any movement. Great, Garrote groaned. Guess we stand here? No. Painstakingly, Marnan got her axe under her. She grit her teeth as she climbed to her feet, leaning on the weapon for support. Her insides burned, and her broken leg would take none of her weight, but at least she was upright, not lying in the muck. No, you go after the others. Help them. Find Branka. I will do what I can to slow down your pursuit. Even Sten turned to look at her measuringly at that. No. Felicity said. Fuck no, Garrote snapped. I can't walk, and the forces ahead will overwhelm the others if they don't get help. I know you feel them too. The darkspawn were closing in around her senses like a noose, and they heard the distant sound of Hugo's barking echoing down the tunnel. There's no time to argue. Go. She speaks wisdom, Sten said. Come. The Qunari took off down the hall, and Khazar cursed and scurried after him. Garrote and Felicity lingered, though, even as the first darkspawn rounded into the chamber from the entrance tunnel. Garrote's hand axe spun across the chamber and embedded into its throat. Felicity reached in to steady her, and Marnan felt a trickle of healing magic seep into her. Marnan turned a scolding look on the mage, but the tears in Felicity's eyes kept her from saying anything. For strength, she whispered. Princess, you sure about this? Garrote asked, retrieving the weapon. Yes. 2 more hurlocks rounded into the chamber, and Garrote dodged them and stabbed one from behind. Marnan turned to meet the other, balancing on one foot as she somehow raised her axe toward it. I'm leaving Orzammar to you, Braska. Please, do what is best for the city. The remaining hurlock lunged at her, and she met it with a wild swing that immediately put her on her knees. She grit her teeth and cut it off at the knees. The scrabbling of genlocks could be heard approaching through the entrance, even as someone down the tunnel screamed. Sod that! Garrote spat, even as Felicity grabbed his arm and they started down the tunnel. We'll be back for you. Don't you dare die before then. Just go. She shouted. She glanced behind her as a trio of genlocks charged around the bend, making sure her friends were gone. When one of them darted around the corner and made for the tunnel, Marnan roared to her remaining foot and lunged at it, blocking it, and any others from following. In war, victory. She hit her knees again soon after, her leg shrieking in pain and every breath bursting through a sharp pain in her abdomen. Her axe, however, was not weakened. It was a whirling blade of death to the darkspawn that dared to attempt to follow the wardens. This was what she had been born to do, the sole sentinel against the wave of death that would crush the world's only hope. In peace, vigilance. This was her duty, to protect them by taking down every one of these monsters that she could. This was her calling. In death, sacrifice. Check the description for the links to the author.